The Banshee by Chris Trottle. The woman's body lay face down in the marshy ground, her hair bedraggled and damp from the dew. One arm was stretched out in front of her, the other rested by her side. It was a freezing cold morning on Farndale Moor. A mist clung to the low hills, and crows grated out a lament for the tragic figure, but one which only the coroner and Constable Lucius Mayer heard. "She's been dead for at least 12 hours, said the coroner, rising from his knees and brushing himself down. "As far as I can tell, the cause of death was strangulation." There was a pause. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you, Barry." 12 hours. Strangulation. Mayer had been staring dejectedly at the damp corpse for some time, without moving or saying anything. He was transfixed by sadness. She was such a lovely girl, a breath of fresh air in this god-forsaken community. The coroner frowned. "There's nothing wrong with this community, Lucius. Maybe it's you who wants to leave, but you can't hold that against the rest of us." Mayer sighed and looked at him. "Oh, I'm not holding anything against anything, Barry." The coroner closed his bag. They stood quietly for a moment, looking down at her, their breath condensing in front of them. "Who found her?" asked Barry. "Mrs. O'Leary. She was taking Morris for his morning walk around 5:30. He put his head in his hands. "Christ, I'm depressed." "Have you told them?" "No. At the moment I can't think how to." "The children loved her, Barry. They're going to be devastated." He sighed. "Absolutely devastated. The little cherubs." His face was growing colder by the minute. "Hang on." He squatted down and looked at the girl's neck area. "Her necklace is gone. How do you know she was wearing it?" "She always did. A beautiful little pearl necklace, and a ring." He looked at her left hand. "No ring either." He stood up. "Robbery, murder?" asked the coroner. "It's too early to tell," replied the constable. A rabbit scuttled away into its burrow. Mayer looked up, frowning into the mist. Chapter 1. 22 years later. It was 11 o'clock on a crisp, bright morning in the village of Cormac, Connemara, on the west coast of Ireland. Yellow leaves fluttered down and landed on the roof of the little gatehouse at the entrance to the churchyard. They covered most of the ground in a melee of colour, piling themselves up against headstones and drifting down into the newly dug grave, as if creating a cushioning effect for the object that would soon be laid to rest there. Pigeons cooed in the branches, and a white cat slipped through the gate and padded away down the narrow road. But the atmosphere in the church itself was altogether different. The coffin lay on the altar, with a single, rather plain wreath of flowers propped in front of it. Standing behind a lectern a few feet away was an elderly gentleman in a black suit, with wispy grey hair and a moustache to go with his sombre, stern-looking features. It was a relatively small group of mourners in matching black that he now began to address in a steady, deep voice. "My wife was a person of great moral standing, not just in this village, but as a young woman growing up in Wales. When I met her, she was already an active member in her church, a dedication which he brought with her here. Not only was Margaret dedicated to the church, she was also dedicated to our 4 children, Nathan, Bronwyn, Ken, and Kieran." Bronwyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Ken's face flushed with emotion when he heard his dead brother's name, and Nathan stared straight ahead of him at nothing in particular, his arms folded. She was a loving mother who gave as much time as she could to her children. Bronwyn rotated her neck irritably and sighed. She looked at her watch. "God, let this be over soon." She leaned in towards her husband and whispered in his ear, "I can't wait to get outside for a cigarette." Mark nodded gently. She picked at a bit of fluff on her dress. Ken, who was seated next to her, was chewing his nail, then examining it alternatively. He was not looking at his father. In fact, he was deliberately trying to look at anything but the old man. Nathan, the oldest of the siblings, was seated next to his wife, who sat in the same pose as her husband, legs crossed, arms folded. When the service was over, everybody filed out after the family had gone ahead of them. Bronwyn was already reaching for cigarettes before she was even at the door. The moment she was outside, she lit up, drawing in a huge gulp of smoke and closing her eyes, waiting for the nicotine rush. God, that was hellish. Her husband rubbed her arm soothingly. You okay? She shrugged, the cigarette back in her mouth. Kane came over to her. She hugged him. Well done, she said. I'm proud of you. Ken nodded. Are you staying for the weekend? He asked. Do you want me to? He nodded. Okay, but you owe me one. Ken smiled. I'll buy you a pack of cigarettes. She put the fag back in her mouth and winked at him. Nathan walked beside his wife as they separated themselves from the crowd so they could talk in private. I better get back, said Miriam. Do you not want to stay for lunch? Not particularly. What do I tell my father? We have 2 small boys who need their mother to tuck them in at night and read them a bedtime story. That's what you can tell him. But whether he'll understand that or not is another matter. All right, just take a deep breath and calm down. He's my father. She looked at the leaves at her feet. Sorry. I appreciate you coming. I know it wasn't easy for you. She laughed coldly. Easy? That man makes me want to slap him every time I see him. Did you hear the bullshit he was sprouting up there? Yeah, I was listening, Miriam. Seamus Doyle approached his daughter. Bronwyn, come and speak to your aunt, please. The last few centimetres of her cigarette were clenched between her fingers. She waved it at him. I'm busy. I'll be free in a minute, though. You can put that thing out and come and speak to her now. Bronwyn locked eyes with her father as she breathed smoke. He glared at her. Don't start this. Not here. Not today. Today we're here for your mother. And when was she ever here for me? When was she ever here for Ken? Seamus stiffened. I'm not getting into this argument, and I'm not coming until I finish this. It'll only take a moment. She can wait that long, can't she? Mind you find a bin for it, he said, and turned away. After a few more drags, she dropped it at her feet and ground it out. Then she reluctantly followed after him. Aunt Orlith hugged her and drew her into the large fur coat she was wearing. Bronwyn smelt the strong perfume. I'm so sorry, said Orlith softly. I'm not, is what Bronwyn really wanted to say, but she bit her tongue and instead said, Thank you. Max wanted to be here, but his health isn't great at the moment. The journey wouldn't have been good for him. I understand. Tell him I was asking after him. I will. Are you joining us for lunch? Of course. Bronwyn addressed her father. Will you excuse us, Dad? Orlith and I need to talk in private for a moment. Seamus left them in peace. Bronwyn linked arms with her aunt, and they strolled together through the gravestones. What is it you would like to talk to me about, dear? Asked Orlith. Nothing in particular. I just want to be on my own with you. Orlith smiled and patted her arm. How are you doing? It's so long since I've seen you. I'm fine. Look, do you mind if I smoke? Not at all, dear, said Orlith. Bronwyn removed an almost full pack of Mayfair and slipped one out. Did you used to smoke? She asked. For a few years, she replied, but I quit when my children were born. I don't have any of those to worry about, said Bronwyn. Mark and I are too busy with our jobs to be thinking about that. You'll need to introduce me to him. When did you get married? Oh, about 7 years ago now. You managed to keep that pretty quiet. Bronwyn exhaled smoke. I know. I'm sorry. I wasn't exactly trying to keep it a secret. I just didn't want the family involved. Something like that. Well, actually, a lot like that. I told my brothers about it, obviously. They were all there. But I made them promise they wouldn't tell Mum and Dad. They fell silent for a moment. She could tell Orlith wanted to say something, but didn't know how to. Just say it. I'm just concerned about you, Bronwyn. That's all. To tell you the truth, I'm surprised you're even here. You left home and you never once went back. Nobody heard from you for years. It's like you cut yourself off from your family. Bronwyn sucked harder at her cigarette. Why did you do that? You don't know what it was like, Orlith. What was like? Living in that house. She took another drag. It was like being a prisoner in your own home, banished upstairs among the eaves like a cluster of unwanted pets. Orleth raised an eyebrow. All right, that's maybe a slight exaggeration, but that's what it felt like sometimes. It was my father's rules that... They weren't just strict, they were cruel, Orleth. She looked at her. They were cruel, she said again. There was no love in that house. They stopped and sat down on a bench. Do you think it's cruel saying that at my mother's funeral? Maybe not so much cruel as inappropriate. She was my sister, after all. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. Oh, I know that. You've got a lot of anger bottled up inside you, and it all comes out in a situation like this. All I can say is that my sister was a lovely woman, with a lot still to give, and her death is extremely heartbreaking. Bronwyn listened to the pigeons calling to one another, and then stopping in mid-flow. It's not really my mother I'm angry with. They were my father's rules. She just went along with them. Well, that's possible. My sister could let herself be led sometimes, but only through weak will. I know she loved you. She loved all of you. She was devastated when Kieran died. Bronwyn looked to the ground. There was a long silence now. It was peaceful in the churchyard. The rest of the mourners spoke in hushed tones and did not disturb the quiet. They were waiting for the coffin to be brought out of the church. She saw Mark chatting to someone she didn't recognise. It hardly surprised her. Most of the people here were old friends of her parents. In the background, strolling among the headstones with his hands in his pockets, was Ken. His head was down and he was kicking leaves. Nobody had expected him to be at the funeral either. He had not been to his brother's, simply because he couldn't bear it. He and Kieran had been extremely close. Why don't you tell me what's really troubling you, Bronwyn? Bronwyn looked at her. What do you mean, what's really troubling me? You used to be a happy child. I remember coming to visit you once and you were all smiles and giggles, like you didn't have a care in the world. What happened to that girl to make her turn all angry? Bronwyn finished her cigarette. She shrugged. Sometimes I was happy, on occasion. No, dear. I'm sorry, but I don't believe that. I was in contact with your mother a lot. All she ever talked about was her children, how they were getting on, how happy they were. And then suddenly all that seemed to change. I don't know what you're talking about, said Bronwyn, reaching for another cigarette. Orleth noticed how her hands shook. Wasn't there a nanny? Bronwyn dropped the packet. What? You had a nanny back then, didn't you? She reached down for the fallen cigarettes. Did we? I don't remember. Yes, you do. Do I? Well, what of it? Orleth scrutinized her for a moment. That's it, isn't it? Bronwyn looked up. Jesus, when is that coffin coming out? Bronwyn, listen to me. She can hardly get the cigarette lit now. Orleth lit it for her. Bronwyn put a hand to her forehead and a fresh cigarette to her mouth. Listen to me, said Orleth again. You need to sort some things out. Why do you think I'm here? She snapped. She pulled hard. There was such a stupid idea. I should never have come. She closed her eyes tight. If I had just stayed in Dublin, nothing would change, said Orleth. And you need change. You need to be free of whatever it is that's been boiling away inside there for years, because it's just going to fester. Bronwyn made an almost imperceptible nod. Mark shook Seamus Doyle's hand. It's nice to meet you finally, said Seamus. Likewise. My daughter's told me nothing about you. Mark smiled. She's told me nothing about you either. Doyle laughed. Oh, that surprises me. I'd have thought she would be, would have told you about the beatings I gave her, about how I locked her in the closets. Mark smiled again. Well, it wasn't quite that, but Seamus nodded. I'm not exactly the father of the century in her eyes. Ah, well, it's not a defined art, is it? No, it certainly isn't. How did you persuade her to come? Actually, it was her decision. I'm just the sport in all this. Nathan appeared. Hi, Mark. Dad, Miriam's gone home. She needs to get back to the boys. I hope that's okay. One less mouth to feed, I suppose, replied Seamus. The cigarette quivered between Bronwyn's fingers. I've tried so hard to forget it all. I even thought about hypnotherapy once, so I could lock it away permanently, but I couldn't quite do that. I wanted it there, It's a part of me. Exactly. You can't just forget about past traumas. You have to work through them in order to sort out the problem. Coming back here is the first step. And it's those first steps that are always the hardest, Bron. What if I can't do it? You can do it. You've got your husband with you for support. You spend a few days here and then you go back to Dublin. And what do I do during those few days? That's up to you, dear. Whatever you want. But try and cross your comfort barriers. You've already done that by coming here. Now just keep on doing it. Sound like it's going to be a fun weekend. Ken leaned his back against a tree and dialed a number on his mobile. It rang several times without anybody answering. He let it ring some more. Please pick up, he thought. Still no reply. His heart started to sink. Hi, babe. He smiled. Hi, gorgeous, he replied. How was it? As bad as I expected. Are you okay? He loved it when she asked that. She had a way of saying it that was so genuine and so caring that even if he was fine, he was sometimes tempted to lie or suddenly wish that he was feeling low. But today there was no need to pretend. I'm not great. I'm trying to keep smiling for everybody, but it's not very easy. It's your mother's funeral, Ken. Nobody's expecting you to smile for God's sake. He laughed. Then he paused. I'm already missing you, he said quietly. I miss you too, babe. So do the boys. They want you to take them to the zoo when you get back. How's Combs' asthma? It's okay. She paused now. Anyway, the zoo. We can make a day of it. The four of us. How does that sound? Sounds brilliant. But a lump was quickly forming in his throat. Then maybe afterwards we can drop the boys off at my mum's and see what happens after that. I better know what you're doing now, said Ken, almost under his breath, as if he was afraid of someone overhearing. And what would that be? She asked. You're biting your bottom lip, aren't you? She laughed. How do you know that? 'Cause I know you. And I love you. He waited. There was a sigh. I know. Again, she sighed. Babe, you know I wish I could say the same. It's just really difficult for me. I'm still getting over Johnny. The boys still talk about him. And in a way, I still love him. Ken's face flushed. But you divorced him, Anna. I'm aware of that, Ken, she said patiently. But when you're with someone for 15 years and you have their children, you don't just stop loving them, however much they may have hurt you. Anger was starting to rise in Ken's chest. It started to heave. So what do you need me for? You bit on the side? Ken, I've done so much for you. I bought you presents. I've looked after your boys. I even took you on that cruise with me. I've made love to you and you shrugged that away as if it were nothing? Oh, Ken, that's not what? Not fair? Oh, I'll tell you what's not fair. Fucking a woman whose tongue is in her mouth, but whose brain thinks is in her ex-husband's. The line went dead. Ken almost threw the phone away. He choked back tears. He felt like a jilted schoolboy. His eyes watered. He concealed himself behind the tree and burst out crying. Of all the times he wanted her to say she loved him, this would have been perfect. But it hadn't happened. He felt like shouting curses at her, like texting something spiteful. Why? Why couldn't she just love him? When he emerged slightly more composed a few minutes later, the coffin was coming out of the church. A few minutes after that, he stood holding his sister's hand as the casket was descended into the ground. Bronwyn noticed that Ken seemed genuinely distracted by something else, but she said nothing. She felt exactly the same. She watched her father standing with his hands held respectfully in front of him, his face stony. And she suddenly felt a wave of fresh anger towards him. Had he stifled her mother's attempts to show her children kindness? Had he stolen a vital part of her childhood? She lowered her eyes. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The coffin reached the bottom of the grave. She'd taken an overdose of her sleeping tablets, according to the coroner, and his verdict was accidental death. There was no suicide note. The pallbearers let go of the ropes. As she was walking back to the car, she was lighting another cigarette. "I really wish you wouldn't do that," said Seamus. "Yeah, well, you know, it's funny. Sometimes what we wish for doesn't always come true." She looked at him. "As a little girl, I used to wish I had parents who loved me, but I never got that." She turned away. "You think I didn't love you, Bron?" "It's Bronwyn, Dad," she said, without looking round. "If I didn't love you, I wouldn't be telling you to stop smoking, would I?" Bronwyn headed back to the car with Mark. They had driven down there that morning, and she was already tired. She'd slept a little on the way, but not much. On arrival, they had come straight to the lawn church. As she reached for the handle, she heard her name being called. She turned. An old woman, who at first glance resembled a bag lady, was standing on the narrow pavement a few feet away. "I thought it was you," she said. Bronwyn stared at her. "You don't remember me, do you?" "I'm Mrs. Randalls. I used to run the bakery when you were a wee girl." "Okay," replied Bronwyn. "Is there anything I can do for you?" "Just watch yourself." "I beg your pardon?" said Bronwyn. "I heard her. The night your mother died." "What the hell are you talking about?" "The Banshee. I heard her crying on the moor, just like she cried when your brother drowned." "Hey!" snapped Mark. "That's enough!" Bronwyn was frozen to the spot, her fingers still on the door handle. She stared at Mrs. Randalls, her mouth open slightly. "You remember her, don't you?" "No, I don't remember anything. Leave me alone." She opened the car and got in. Mark did the same. As they drove away, Bronwyn watched Mrs. Randalls in the rear-view mirror. "Jesus, some people," said Mark. Chapter 2. Cormac was an idyllic little village in a picturesque spot right on the coast, next to a little inlet of sea. Overlooking this was Cormac Hill. Legend had it that Cormac was a giant who loved to sit there and dip his feet into the salt water. There was a fantastic viewpoint from the top of the hill where you could look out in all directions, but especially to the west over the Atlantic and back inland over towards Farndale Moor on the other side of the village. Mark drove slowly along the main street, which could hardly have been described as main. Bronwyn sat staring out the window, her hands in her lap. It had been 16 years. 16 years of pain, which, as Olaf said, had been bottled up inside her, because she had tried to hide it away. But it had eaten away at her soul, at who she was, turning her sour and bitter until she could almost taste herself. And she realized she didn't like that taste. She'd had to come back. They drove past the little white cottages with smoke spiralling from their chimneys, past Mrs. Randall's bakery, which now had a new sign outside. Old Mrs. Randall's and her Banshee stories. Bronwyn did remember. It was a stupid fairy tale that had started when they were children. Irish tradition and folklore told of a wailing spirit that foretold the death of usually a family member shortly before their demise. They were normally associated with large families of some importance. The only thing vaguely important about the Doyles was that they owned the land which Cormac village was built, and had done for 200 years. The stories had begun late one evening, 19 years ago, when her brother Kieran and her had heard what she described as a woman crying. He'd been in the garden when he'd heard it, floating across Farndale Moor in the pitch black of an autumn night. It had scared him half to death at the time, but obviously hadn't done that much damage, as the very next day he was out telling the entire village about it. It was Mrs. Randalls in the bakery who first suggested a possible source for the noise. "Maybe it was the Banshee," she said, picking out 4 sweet pastries. "What's that?" Kieran had asked. "You've never heard of the Banshee before?" asked Mrs. Randalls, looking surprised. "The Banshee is an old Irish ghost. They're heard screaming and crying before somebody dies." She started wrapping the pastries. "So you better watch yourself. She might be after you." Kieran had gone silent then, until Mrs. Randalls had given him a wink and handed over the parcel of goodies. Late that night, Seamus Doyle had been coming down the stairs when he had lost his footing and fallen to the bottom, hitting his head on the stone tile floor. He had been rushed to hospital with a fractured skull and a broken arm, and remained there for a period of 3 weeks. On hearing this, Mrs. Randalls had immediately begun proclaiming to everybody who had come into her shop that day that Seamus Doyle's accident had been foretold by the Banshee, and so the stories were born. They passed the small post office on the corner. "It's hardly changed," she said. "Did you think it would have?" Bronwyn shrugged. "I couldn't care less." At the edge of the village was a little humpback bridge, which crossed Farndale Falls, a beautiful waterfall that carried the water down river into Cormac Cove. She tried not to think what else it had carried there 3 years ago. She still missed her younger brother Kieran. They were getting closer now, and the knot in her stomach began to tighten. The house was right on the edge of Farndale Moor, and was named after it. It was a large, old brick building, complete with crow-step gables and grey turrets. It looked more like a castle in many ways than a house. It was certainly big enough. It had been built in the late 1700s and passed down through the family ever since. Bronwyn remembered the large entrance hall and the grand staircase. She remembered running through the upstairs corridors, a young girl of 7 playing hide-and-seek with her brothers. The rooms on the upper floor had once been used as servants' quarters. When Bronwyn was a girl, it had been used as the nursery and the children's bedrooms. They had spent a lot of time up there, mainly because of their father's strict rules about being kept out of the way whenever there was visitors in the house, or simply when their parents didn't want them around. Bronwyn squeezed her fingers together as they drove the last stretch of road before they arrived. Mark reached over and took her hand. "You're shaking." "Yeah," said Bronwyn, nodding. "I'm scared." Mark looked at her sympathetically. "It's all right. You'll be fine." The turrets rose from behind the tops of the trees a few moments later. Bronwyn's heart began beating faster. The house appeared in all its stateliness as Mark drove in through the main gates. There was no long driveway. The house was just off the little country road they had just driven along, surrounded by gravel and a large garden, with nothing but a low hedge between it and the moor. "Oh, my God," said Bronwyn in a low voice. Her limbs went weak. Cars were parked on the gravel in front of the house, and people were already going in. "I can't do this," she said, looking desperately at Mark. "Yes, you can. You've come this far." "No, I can't, honestly. Turn the car around now." "Don't be absurd, Bron." She put her face in her hands. "I can't do this," she said again. Mark stopped the car next to a grey Mercedes. He turned off the engine. Bronwyn kept her face hidden. He waited. "It's just a house," he said. Then he noticed she was crying. He unbuckled himself and leaned over to hug her. He kissed her tenderly on the top of her head and stroked her long brown curls. "You don't understand," she said, her voice muffled and filled with emotion. "I know. I'm sorry." They sat in the car 5 minutes longer. At one point Seamus appeared at the front door and looked towards them. Mark signalled to give them a bit of time. "Do you want to go back?" he asked her. She removed her hands from her face and sat up straight. Her eyes were red. "It's up to you, sweetheart. I'm not going to force you to stay if you really don't want to." He handed her a tissue from the glove compartment. "As you say, I've come all this way. What's the point in going back now?" She wiped her eyes. "Come on. Let's do it." They got out of the car. Bronwyn instantly felt the wind coming off the moor. It was a biting wind, an unforgiving wind, and something else she remembered from childhood. She shivered involuntarily. Mark took her hand, and they walked towards the house. She was holding her breath as they walked in over the threshold. The entrance hall was warm. The heat came from the fireplace straight ahead of them, an original feature that her father had always liked. Huge logs crackled and spat in the grate, and a large pair of blowers were propped against the wall in the hearth. Just in front of that, a wire-haired terrier lay stretched out on the flagstones. Bronwyn frowned. "We never used to have a dog," she said. Mark chuckled. The living-room doors were open, and people were milling about inside. Bronwyn squeezed Mark's hand as they entered. It was a large, bright room with lots of space. Another fire was on. Some people were seated on sofas and chairs, others were standing, some of them with drinks in their hands. Bronwyn remembered this room as being somewhere she was only allowed occasionally, like on a birthday or other special events. Otherwise the children were strictly prohibited from being in there. Her father had once caught her in there, playing with a big globe in the corner. He had smacked her and sent her back upstairs. He was standing there now, spinning it lovingly under his hand as if caressing it. He seemed to have more fondness for that than his children. Orlith was standing by the fireplace with a glass of red wine in her hand, speaking to somebody. "I'm really not up for conversation, Mark," said Bronwyn. "That's all right." Her father spotted them and headed in their direction. "Christ," she muttered. "Glad to see you could join us," he said. "Would you like a drink?" "Whiskey." "Mark?" I'll have a white wine, please." "Do you want water in that, Bron?" "No." She spotted an empty chair and made a beeline for it. "I can't be bothered standing until lunch." There was a bowl of peanuts sitting on the coffee table next to her. She helped herself. Her father soon brought the drinks over. "When did you get that dog?" asked Bronwyn. "About 5 years ago now. His name's Wolfgang." "What made you decide to do that?" "Your mother was getting lonely. All of you had gone. It was also a good way of keeping us exercised." Mark smiled. "He's lovely. Is he friendly?" "When he isn't sleeping," replied Seamus. He left them. "Wolfgang?" mused Mark. "After Mozart, my father's always been a big fan of his music." She chewed on a peanut. Somebody approached, a man she didn't recognize. "Bronwyn, isn't it?" he asked, his voice husky. "Yes. Please accept my condolences." "Thank you. I'm Arthur Hargreaves. Nice to meet you. This is my husband, Mark. You will excuse me, I need to use the little girl's room." She left the room and headed across the entrance hall. She stopped halfway and changed direction, going down a narrow hallway with wood panelling on the walls. The toilet was small, with potpourri in a bowl on top of the cistern and yellow flowers next to the mirror, which had begun to wilt. These were her mother's touches. As she was walking back, she felt a sudden cold breeze on her left ankle. She stopped and looked down. It was then she noticed the small gap at the bottom of the panelling, and knew at once it was a door. A door that had been designed to blend in. The door the servants used to go up the back stairs. The door that had separated Bronwyn and her brothers from their parents. The breeze sliced against her ankle. In the next moment she had walked on, back to the warmth of the living room. Lunch was served at 1:45. The group filed to the dining room and took their places at the large table. The walls were adorned with stuffed animal heads and old rifles, as well as a few portraits of original family members, all of them men, with guns cocked under their arms and dogs at their feet. Bronwyn hated them, as she did the room itself. Yet another fire was burning. Lunch was an excruciating affair. Bronwyn could hardly stomach anything. Her father sat at the head of the table, just in case anybody didn't realize he was the man of the house. Bronwyn ate a few pieces of lettuce, while Mark sat next to her, tucking into roast lamb. "Is that all you're going to eat?" "I'm not hungry," she said. "Have some tomato—" "I'm not hungry." Mark sighed. "At least get a meal out of being here." "Would you just leave it, please?" "All right, but I'm just saying, better if you ate something. Don't patronize me, Mark." She reached for the water jug and poured herself a glass. "I'm not trying to patronize you. I'm just trying to help you. Well, it would be helpful if you didn't comment on what I'm eating." Mark left it alone after that. Between mains and dessert, she slipped outside for a cigarette. She stood in the biting wind and smoked quickly. Pudding was a chocolate roulade, of which she had had a tiny slither with a little extra cream. She helped clear away the plates at the end of the meal. The kitchen was just off the dining room, and it had a large, deep stone sink. Bronwyn dumped a pile of plates in the soapy water, and then took the food waste out the back door and across the cobbled yard towards the old sheds and outhouses. She opened one of the shed doors and went in. A large sow was lying in her pen, grunting happily in the straw. They had always kept pigs. Her father sold the meat to the village butcher, but occasionally kept some back for the family. His latest sow was heavily pregnant. Her mate had been put in a separate shed, according to her father. She leaned over the side of the pen and tipped the leftover food into the trough. The sow immediately struggled to her feet and trotted over, her ears flicking. Bronwyn smiled. She had a soft spot for pigs. Her father suddenly appeared in the doorway. "You didn't eat much at lunch." "Don't you start," said Bronwyn. "I put you guys on the top floor. I thought you might like that." "Did you? Or maybe you just wanted us out of the way again." Bronwyn went out of the car to get their bags. Hers was a little heavier than Mark's. When she opened the door to the back stairs, the draught hit her full on, as if she had just opened the door to a fridge. She hesitated. The anxiety and memories came back now, flooding into her thoughts like a strong, desperate current, eager to drown her in the misery of the past. She swallowed hard. "Break your comfort barriers, Bronwyn," she told herself. She started to ascend the narrow staircase, holding onto the walls on either side. The ceiling above her head was low and sloped. After the first 13 steps, the stairs turned a sharp corner and carried on up. They were dark wooden stairs that creaked dreadfully underfoot. Bronwyn remembered running up them after her brothers. Orloth was right. She had been happy once, although it felt like a long time ago now. These stairs and the upper corridors had been theirs, their own playground. For best part of the time she was quite content being up there, with Siobhan. Siobhan had long dark hair like hers, although it was straight rather than curly. She wore jeans and fun t-shirts and always had a beautiful pearl necklace on, along with a ring with a small red stone set into it. She always smiled, not a false, shy smile, but a genuine smile, full of warmth and vitality. She loved to play games with them. Siobhan was their nanny. That was until one cold autumn morning when her body was found on Farndale Moor. And like that, she wasn't there anymore. When Bronwyn reached the top of the stairs, the door was closed. Beyond it was her childhood. She stopped. There was total silence. That was something else she remembered, the silences. From the top of the house, she couldn't hear the people downstairs. There was a small skylight just above her head with grimy glass, which had a little crack in it, through which a cold draught was blowing on her hair. She opened the door. Another cold draught. The corridor stretched ahead of her. White walls, bare wooden floorboards, old and unpolished. There were more skylights along the ceiling, letting in plenty of natural light. The corridor continued to her left. There were several passages up here, with 10 rooms in all, including a small bathroom. Bronwyn walked forward. She knew her bedroom was along here. It always had been, and her father would have made sure he put her in the same place. She wasn't mistaken. It was the third door. The room looked different, though. There were 2 landscape watercolours on the walls, where once there had been posters of the Red Devils, her favourite heavy metal band. There was a double bed now, and a rug in front of the old fireplace. In the grate itself were dried flowers. There were fireplaces in all the 7 bedrooms, but they had all been blocked up now. Even as a girl, she had not been allowed to light the fire in her bedroom for reasons of safety. She dumped the bags on the bed. It was freezing up here. She went to the window opposite the foot of the bed and looked out over the moor and one of the turrets which had a window at this level. The turret formed an alcove in one of the servant rooms. It was the room Siobhan had once occupied. She turned back to the bed. There was a low cabin next to it with a little lamp on top. Her parents had obviously used these as guest rooms when the children had gone. She went over to a pine chest of drawers and opened the top drawer. Inside were a pair of pale blue towels. She started to unpack and then stopped. There was a longing, suddenly, an urge to go and explore. She left the bags where they were and stepped out into the passage, closing the door behind her. She started to stroll along the corridors, looking into rooms as she went. She looked into Ken's bedroom, which had been next door to hers. then into Nathan's, which was further away. Kieran's bedroom was in a separate wing, just along from their old bedroom. Bronwyn hesitated at this door. This was where they had spent most of their time with Siobhan. They played board games together, as well as games like charades. She read them stories, wonderful stories like Peter Pan. She remembered Ken and Kieran dressing up as John and Michael, whereas Bronwyn had put on a tutu and a sparkly leotard to transform herself into Tinkerbell. The story had taken several evenings to finish. She opened the door. It had been turned into a smart living room, with a sofa and chairs and mahogany coffee table. The floor had been carpeted. Bronwyn stood in the middle of the floor. She stood very still. She could hear Siobhan's voice, that pretty Irish lilt she had. She always spoke softly. Her tone and words were never harsh.
"Hey, Brom, come and show me your drawing," she was saying. "I did it for you," she heard herself reply. "It's a leprechaun. See, he's all green. This is his big hat that he wears, and that's his pipe."
Bronwyn saw the pair of them in her mind. She was seated on Siobhan's lap, proudly displaying her picture.
"And where does the leprechaun live?" asked Siobhan. "At the end of the rainbow."
"That's right, where all the gold is. Do you think he's going to share any of that with me, or is he going to keep it for himself?"
"I think he's going to keep it all for himself."
Siobhan laughed. Bronwyn blinked back tears. She left the old nursery and walked down the corridor until she came to Siobhan's room. It was small, with the alcove in the corner. It still had a single bed. She sat down in it, her legs weak. Siobhan had occupied this space for the 5 years that she was with them. Her energy was still there. Her positivity lingered in the atmosphere. Bronwyn fingered the bedclothes. She remembered how Siobhan had always tucked her in at night. She would carefully pull the covers over her and make sure she was snug before giving her a hug and a kiss and turning out the bedside light. She didn't remember her father or mother ever doing that. Something broke inside her at that moment. She gasped, tears dripping onto the duvet. And then it came. The pain, the emotion, the loss. She wailed. She lay down on the bed, tucked her knees up to her chest, and sobbed like the lost child she was. "I miss you," she said to the empty room. "I miss you so much." Chapter 3. 22 years earlier. Lucius Mayer pulled the car onto the gravel and switched off the engine. His hands were shaking. He felt like he was going to throw up. "You have to do this," he told himself. "It's your job." He forced himself out of the car. It was 8:15. The body would be lying in the hospital morgue by now, a 10-mile drive down the road. Mayer pulled on the large handle at the front door. He heard the bell faintly ringing through the house. A few moments later he heard Seamus's quick, purposeful steps, and the large wooden door was yanked open. "Lucius!" He looked and sounded surprised. Mayer removed his hat. "Good morning, Seamus. What's wrong? Can I come in a moment?" Seamus opened the door wider. They crossed the large entrance hall, where he showed them into the living room. "Can I get you coffee?" "No, I'm fine, thank you." He looked at Seamus. "I've got some bad news for you. Maybe you should sit down." "No, I don't think so. What have you got to tell me?" Mayer started to stutter and mumble something. "Oh, for God's sake, man, spit it out. Siobhan's dead." Seamus stared at him. I'm sorry, what?" Mayer swallowed. "Siobhan's dead," he repeated. "Her body was found on Farndale Moor earlier this morning." "I'm so sorry." Seamus suddenly looked like he was about to fall over. "I think I will sit down, actually." He almost dropped into the armchair behind him. He began mumbling himself. How, he began. "The coroner thinks she was strangled." He paused.
When was the last time you saw her? Yesterday morning. She took the children to school at about 8:10. She returned by 9:30. My children go to St Agnes Primary in Colston. Mary nodded. So the last time you saw her was in the morning? No, I saw her later that afternoon, maybe about 2 o'clock. A friend was bringing the children back that afternoon, so I gave Siobhan some time off. The last time I saw her, she was going to the village. I don't know if she went to Colston after that. She may have done. I'm sorry, Lucius. You'll have to excuse me. I need a drink. He got up and went over to the cabinet. He removed a glass and a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a generous amount, spilling some of it in the process. His hands shook so much he could barely drink it. He leaned against the cabinet and closed his eyes. He tried to take several deep breaths. Mr. Doyle. "What the hell are you doing here?" he bellowed suddenly. Lucius jumped. And then he saw the little girl in the doorway. She was wearing a pretty dress, and her hair was naturally beautiful, with bobbing curls that rested on her shoulders. Her face might have been so pretty too, had it not been contorted into an expression of shock. "How long have you been standing there?" demanded Seamus. She didn't answer him. She was staring at the constable, her mouth opened slightly. Mayor thought he would cry at any moment. "Bronwyn," he began. Her chin began to quiver. "Bronwyn, you go back to the nursery now." She didn't move. "God damn it, Bronwyn, do as you're told!" And then Bronwyn did do something. She lost control of her bladder. Mayor rushed forward as the girl swayed and then fell. Seamus laid her down on the sofa as Mayor ran to get her water. Margaret appeared. She ran towards her daughter. "Ron, she's fainted." "What's going on?" "They found Siobhan's body on the moor." "Oh, dear God." Bronwyn overheard. "She's peed on the floor over there. Go and get a mop and a bucket before it starts to stain." "But just do it, Margaret," snapped Seamus. Margaret obeyed. Lucius came back with a glass of water. "What do I do?" he asked, flustered. "You're the policeman." Lucius dipped his fingers in the glass and dabbed some water on her lips. "It might stimulate her," he said. "Water's not going to wake her up." Seamus slapped his daughter's face. "Come on, Bronwyn," he shouted. She opened her eyes with a start then and took a quick, deep breath. "That's it. Good girl." Bronwyn started to whimper. "We should get her a doctor," said Mayor. "She'll be fine. I'll put her into bed with a hot water bottle. She'll be right as rain in a few hours. Seamus, she really needs medical attention." Seamus thought for a moment. "Well, if you think so." He looked up. "Jesus, where's that woman? Margaret!" "I'm here," she called back. She appeared a moment later with a mop and a bucket. "Once you've done that, Mayor thinks you should call a doctor." "I'll call it from my car," he said. He went out to his vehicle and made a call on his radio. As he was walking back, he thought of something. "Seamus," he said, as he re-entered the house, "didn't Siobhan sleep here?" "Yes, she did." "So were you not concerned when she didn't return last night?" "I told you I gave her the evening off." "You said you gave her time off." "Time, evening, whatever. I went to bed early last night, so she could have come in when I was asleep. But you had a friend nearby, and sometimes she stayed there." "So she had done so in the past?" "Yes." "Can you give me this friend's name?" "I don't know anything about him, I'm afraid." "And she didn't mention anything about staying there last night?" "Why would she?" "You're her employer." "That's right. I'm her employer, not her father." Mayor nodded. "Okay. I was expecting her back any time now. But I must go upstairs. Let the boys know what's happened." Lucius nodded. "Very well. Would you like help putting Bronwyn in bed?" Seamus looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he replied. They helped Bronwyn up the stairs between them and escorted her back to her bedroom. "In you get," said Seamus. Bronwyn was crying. "Come on, it's all right." He sat down on the edge of the bed. "These things happen, I'm afraid. That's just life. But you shouldn't be eavesdropping, young lady. That was naughty." "I wasn't eavesdropping. I just came to ask you something." "Well, all right." The girl was shaking. "The constable called you a doctor. You just lie there." Mayer came in with a water bottle. Seamus took it from him and stuck it under the blanket. "There now. Just rest," he said. He now made his way to the nursery, where Ken and Kieran had been waiting eagerly for Siobhan to arrive. "Boys,
I'm afraid I have some bad news for you. Siobhan won't be coming today. Kieran's face fell. Why not? She's dead, Kieran. I'm sorry. The boys stared at their father. I was going to show her my new game that I made up, said Ken in a low voice. Well, you'll just have to play it between the two of you. Ken started crying. I'm sorry, said Seamus again. Then he awkwardly left the room. Mayor asked Seamus to show him where Siobhan slept. He took him along to her room. She didn't have many things, said Seamus. I'm presuming that's what you wanted to see. Mayor nodded silently, his eyes moving around the space. It's nice, he said sadly. The constable cleared his throat. Have you any idea who might have wanted to do this to her? He asked. Not a clue. She hadn't made any enemies around the village? Not at all. Everybody always sang her praises. You know that. Siobhan just got on with her life, and she got on with her job. She was a good employee. Did she seem at all anxious when she left yesterday? Not that I recall. Mayor sighed. He sifted through her chest of drawers. She was missing her jewellery, Seamus. Was she wearing it yesterday? Seamus frowned. Yes, she was. It might have been a mugging that went wrong, said Mayor. Is that the official line? No, so don't say anything. I never had to investigate a murder before. I may need help. He shook his head. She was found in the middle of the moor, miles from the village, but according to the coroner, she died where she fell. There were no tyre tracks or... Lucius, I appreciate you coming here, but really, I don't particularly want to hear the grisly details at the moment. Of course, I'm sorry. I wasn't, I'm sorry, he said again. He closed the last drawer. If you just give me a minute up here, I'll come when I'm finished. Seamus nodded and left. He waited until he heard Doyle descending the stairs. Then he made his way back along the corridor to Bronwyn's room. He knocked gently on the door and went in. How are you feeling? He asked her. He could tell Bronwyn had been crying into her pillow. Who did this to her? She asked, through snivelling. Mayor sat on the bed. I don't know, Bronwyn, he said gently. Did she tell you anything about a nasty person? Somebody who she didn't like? No. Do you know if she ever kept a diary? No. But I do. A diary? Asked Lucius. Bronwyn nodded. She reached in under her pillow and removed a colourfully bound book. I always keep it here. It's a diary of good things. Siobhan said it would help me to be happy, to write down everything that was good and nice in my life. And she said that if I kept it under my pillow, I would have nice dreams. Lucius smiled. Would I be allowed to read it? He asked. Bronwyn handed it to him, nodding. Thank you. I promise I'll bring it back. In fact, do you know what I'm going to do? I'll make a copy of it. How do you do that? Well, there's a very clever machine called a photocopier. It makes copies of things very quickly. So I'll be able to bring it straight back. Let's say this afternoon. I'll come back and see how you are. I'll bring you some sweeties. How about that? Bronwyn nodded, but she didn't quite smile. Okay. The doctor should be here any minute. He rose. The door creaked. Seamus stood there. I'll see you later, Bronwyn. Seamus closed the door behind them. You were just what? I was trying to find out a bit from Elman, that's all. I thought she might... Let's just get something straight right now. These are my children. You will not interrogate them. You will not speak to them without my express permission. Is that understood? My children know more about this tragedy than I do. I didn't mean to... Is that understood? Mayor nodded. Yes, it's understood. Right. Now what are you planning on doing with that? Reading it, to see if there's anything in here that might shed some light on this situation. Seamus raised his eyebrows. A child's diary. You think a child's diary is going to help you solve this murder? It might. Well, then you're right. You do need help. Bronwyn hugged the hot water bottle to her chest. She felt lost. Siobhan, she kept saying over and over. But Siobhan didn't come. Siobhan couldn't come. Siobhan was dead. Somebody had killed her.
but these things happened, according to her father. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "Goodbye, Siobhan," she whispered. Chapter 4. Bronwyn opened her eyes. She lay there for a few seconds before trying to sit up. She was still in Siobhan's old room. She must have fallen asleep. What time was it? Her head throbbed. She was freezing cold as well. There was very little heating in these blasted attic rooms. She dragged her legs over the side of the bed and rubbed her face wearily. She could smell something, like air freshener. She stood up. The pain in her head throbbed even harder. She swayed slightly. As she made her way back to her own room, Mark appeared at the top of the stairs. "Hi," he said. "You been sleeping?" She nodded. "Yeah. What time is it?" 10 to 7. "I was just coming up to see if you wanted to join us for drinks before supper." "Not really." Mark sighed. "Let me have a shower first. It's bloody freezing up here." "When can we expect you?" "When I'm ready." She disappeared into her room. 20 minutes later she joined them in the drawing room. She was wearing tracksuit bottoms and a large woolly jumper with thick socks on her feet. "Good heavens," said her father. "Are we in the North Pole?" "Perhaps not down here, but your attic could do with some radiators. Make that 2 whiskies." Seamus was pouring whiskey into a glass. She took the one he'd just poured and sat down with it. He scowled and removed another glass. "What are we eating?" she asked. "Food," replied Seamus. "Yeah, what kind of food?" "The kind you don't ask about." "Oh, that kind. I can't wait." She looked around her. "Are there any more of those peanuts?" "No," said her father. "Shame. I could have happily eaten those for supper." Mark chuckled quietly into his wine. "You'll eat what you're given, Bron. Not if I don't like it. And don't call me Bron." Nathan intervened. "How about a game of Monopoly after supper?" "No," said Bronwyn. "You could play Cluedo," suggested Ken. She looked at him. "Whatever." "Mark, game of Cluedo after supper?" "I'm up for that." There was an awkward silence now. Mark stared into his glass. Bronwyn sat in an armchair with her legs crossed, sipping intermittently. Her father sat opposite, staring daggers at her, while Nathan examined a book on one of his shelves. He pulled it out by the spine. It was the very old print of Robert Louis Stevenson Kidnapped. "I didn't know you had this." "What is it?" He held it up. "I've had it for years." "Evidently." He flicked through it gently. "Do you mind if I read it?" "Why would I mind?" Nathan shrugged. "No reason, I suppose, except that you might not have wanted it to be removed because of its age." "It's there to be read," he said, raising the whiskey glass to his lips. "My great-grandmother used to keep a diary," said Mark, "in which she mentions being friends with him while he was studying engineering at Edinburgh University." "What was she studying?" asked Nathan. "Actually, she was just doing secretarial work in the same department." "Yes, I wouldn't have thought there would be too many women studying back then," said Seamus. "No," said Bronwyn. "Society was still of the opinion that men were superior to women, which still hasn't changed in some places." "Well, I suppose in many respects they're right, Bronwyn." "No, they're not right. Women are just as intelligent as men, sometimes more so." "Well, that may be so, but generally speaking, a woman's place is in the home." Bronwyn scoffed. "Rubbish, Dad. Look at the situation today. You've got women earning the money, and the fathers at home with the children. It's gone full circle. If you ask me, I rather like that. You didn't wipe bums, did you, Dad?" "I beg your pardon?" "You didn't wipe bums. You left that horrible stuff for Mum to do. But then that's what women are good for, isn't it?" Seamus swallowed the remainder of his whiskey. "I'm going to check on the soup," he said, rising. Bronwyn stuck her finger up at the closing door. "Bronwyn, please," said Nathan. "What? You heard him." "I heard you too. Just stop winding him up." "I'm not winding him up." "You are a bit." "Leave her alone, Nathan," said Ken. Bronwyn shot her younger brother a glance. Silence returned again. "I used to keep a diary," she said. "Really?" asked Mark. Bronwyn nodded. "I've no idea what happened to it. I stopped writing it when—" She paused and then changed the subject. A minute or so later, Seamus came back to announce the dinner was ready. The soup was already steaming in the bowls when they took their places at the table. Bronwyn made sure she had her back to the huge fire. There was crusty bread with the soup, which was a thick vegetable broth.
Seamus took his customary place at the head of the table. "Before we start, I would like to say something." Bronwyn looked annoyed. Her spoon was already dipped in the soup. "This weekend is supposed to be a special time, a time which we spend in each other's company. This family rarely spends time together, and I thought it would be a good opportunity, especially as we are now 2 members short." He paused. Ken's face was grim. He stared at his bowl without moving. Bronwyn let go of her spoon and sat back in the chair, sighing. "I think it's important that we remember your mum and Kieran, remembering the good times we had with them. We should trust that they're both together now." Ken choked back tears. Bronwyn looked up at him. "Please don't cry here," she thought. He wiped his eyes. "Please feel free to discuss things openly and bring up anything you feel needs to be brought up." He was looking at Bronwyn. "I'm well aware there are some issues with this family." "Issues?" echoed Bronwyn incredulously. "Things that maybe could have been done differently. I know I was not always the most loving father to you children. I fully admit that. But that's in the past, and we should leave it there. Let bygones be bygones." "That's all very well for you to say, Dad," said Bronwyn. She was breathing heavily now, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Mark took her hand. She was close to pushing it away, but she refrained. It wasn't Mark she was angry with, after all. He had come to support her, and that was what he was doing now. "However," continued her father, "we are all adults here. I will not put up with tantrums, Bronwyn." "Excuse me? You hurt me. You're not a child anymore. I'm quite prepared to listen to whatever it is you have to say, but only if you can say it in a civilized manner. I'm not going to have any more petty arguments with you." She noticed Nathan was nodding. "Don't you dare nod at me," she hissed. "Bronwyn, you were hardly ever around anyway. You were off playing prefect at boarding school when I was growing up, so don't you nod at me, you self-righteous—" She bit her tongue. Nathan glared at her. "Come on, Bronwyn," said Mark softly. "Let it go." He was moving his thumb gently back and forth across her hand. Her chest was heaving with emotion. Nathan picked up his spoon and started eating his soup. After a few moments of watching him, Bronwyn did the same. Not another word was spoken throughout the rest of the meal. Words were instead replaced by monotonous sounds of clinking cutlery. By the time she had finished a second bowl of soup, she was dying for a cigarette. She abruptly excused herself and went out to the back door. She stood under the yard light and smoked. She could hear the sow in her shed. There was no pudding this time, only fruit. Bronwyn had an apple. When the dinner was over, she sat alone with Mark in the dining room and cried. Mark held on to her. "I love you," he said. "Remember that." She nodded. "Why is he taking Dad's side?" Mark had no answer for her. By the time they joined the others, the Cluedo board had already been set up on one of the coffee tables. "Who do you want to beat, Bronwyn?" asked Ken. "Colonel Mustard or Miss Scarlet?" "You choose," she said. The game got underway. Wolfgang padded through the open doorway and made his way over to see what was going on. He sniffed Bronwyn's shoe and then looked up at her and wagged his tail. She stroked the top of his head. The game plodded on slowly and quietly, gradually reaching its conclusion. At one point Bronwyn let her eyes wander around the little group. She observed her brothers the longest, but especially Ken. Ken loved board games. He always had. As children they had played many games with Siobhan, including the one they were playing now. In fact, it was probably the same board they were using. Siobhan was up for anything. She was so imaginative. They would make cards together for Christmas and birthdays, using glue and stickers and all sorts of exciting things. They made advent calendars as well. Bronwyn loved drawing the baby Jesus in his makeshift crib. She always thought it looked so cozy. She had once gone out to the hay barn and made herself a little nest under the stars. She had fallen asleep there in great contentment, only to be woken by Siobhan carrying her back inside. "I was sleeping like the baby Jesus," she said. "I know," replied Siobhan, "but it's still very cold out there. You don't want to get sick before Father Christmas comes, do you?" They did so much with Siobhan, and she never got angry with them. They never displeased her, unlike their father, who seemed to tell them off for the slightest things. Punishment was the order of the day when Seamus was around. Siobhan refused to punish them. She didn't have the heart to do so. I'm going to make an announcement. An accusation now, said Nathan. I think it was Mr. Plum in the kitchen with a rope. He leaned forward and picked up the black wallet in the centre of the board. Drum roll, please. He opened it. Oh, bloody hell, Ken. There's only 2 cards in here. Ken frowned. I put 3 in there, he said. No, Ken, you didn't. There's only Mr. Plum and the rope. No kitchen. He threw the cards down on the board. I put 3 in, yelled Ken. What the hell do you think I did with the 3rd one? Well, I don't know. You tell me. Oh, calm down, Nathan, said Bronwyn. It's just a game. You've got 2 out of the 3, and it's obvious it was the kitchen, so why are you screaming about? Yeah, Nathan. Nathan held up his hands. All right, sorry. Crisis over. It's just a little annoying, that's all. They searched for the missing card, but could not find it. I thought we had all of them, said Seamus. Ken was shaking his head. I don't understand it, he said. I definitely put 3 cards in there. Never mind, said Bronwyn. Seamus made hot chocolate for them all, in an attempt to calm things down again. Bronwyn and Mark sat on the sofa together, sipping their warm drinks and eating digestives. Nathan got stuck into his book, and Ken walked around the room, biscuit in hand, still searching for the elusive Cluedo card. Wolfgang, meanwhile, sat in front of his master, eyeing up his biscuit. No, said Seamus for the 4th time. For once, thought Bronwyn, he's got his hands full with that dog. It won't take no for an answer. It was 10 o'clock by the time they finished their drinks, and it was decided that they would retire to bed. Bronwyn wanted to go for a last cigarette. She put on a pair of old Wellington boots and slipped out a side door into the garden. She made her way across to a swing bench that faced out over the moor. She sat down under the canopy and lit a Mayfair. She pushed herself gently forward and back and relaxed in the cushions. Can I join you a moment? She looked up. Nathan was standing there. Would that be okay, or will you just bite my head off again? She patted the cushions next to her. Nathan sat down. I'm not on anybody's side, he said. Bronwyn exhaled smoke. I'm trying to be diplomatic. No, you're right, I wasn't there a lot of the time, but I wasn't off playing prefect. Bronwyn allowed herself to smile. I thought that's what you were. No, that's what I told you I was. Bronwyn laughed and elbowed her brother in the ribs. I was just trying to impress my youngest sister. She smiled at him. It worked, she said. She sighed. He makes me so angry sometimes. Sometimes? All the time. How long have you been smoking? Asked Nathan. Longer than you might think, she replied. And how long is that? Since I was 14. Jesus, Bronwyn. You've got to stop. I know, said Bronwyn, as if she had no intention of doing so. I'm serious, Bronwyn. It'll only cause problems. How many are you smoking a day? She shrugged. It depends. On what? On whether... Look, usually I smoke 20, okay? Nathan shook his head. I know. Mark's been saying the same thing. So just leave it, all right? Fair enough. He kissed her on the cheek. Good night, sis. See you in the morning. See ya, she replied. She leaned back in the cushions and closed her eyes. The night air was scented with something other than tobacco smoke. The cigarette burned slowly between her fingers. She could hear a fox crying somewhere out on the moor. No, that wasn't a fox. She opened her eyes and sat up, listening. What the hell was that? Something was crying. She knew it wasn't a fox. Their cries were distinctive. Was it a bird of some description? She held her breath, straining hard to hear it. It seemed to be coming in waves, as if floating on the bitter breeze that came off the moor. Another wave came, and this time she heard it clearly. It was human, and it was a woman. What was somebody doing out on the moor at this time of night? Whoever it was, she sounded heartbroken. Wave after wave of sobs came to Bronwyn's ears. This woman was obviously distressed about something. Bronwyn stood up and walked forward towards the edge of the garden. She peered into a black void. She could see absolutely nothing. And then she realized she could hear absolutely nothing. The crying seemed to have stopped abruptly. She frowned. Had she fallen down and hit her head? One doesn't go from heart-breaking sobs to silence just like that. She was wondering whether to call out or not when she heard Nathan's voice again. "Bronwyn, I'm here," she called back. "What is it?" "I forgot to say. Just make sure you bolt this door before you go to bed." "I'm coming now," she replied. Chapter 5. 24 years earlier. The children were all seated on the floor of the nursery, with the board game in the middle. It was snakes and ladders. Bronwyn was sitting close up against Siobhan, who was sitting cross-legged. She wore a baggy t-shirt, and her hair was in a rather flimsily put-up-together bun. They were on the last phase of the game. It was 4:30 on a bleak, wind-swept afternoon. Rain lashed the windows. There was no possibility of a walk, which normally they would have done when they returned from school. Siobhan loved to take them across the moor, telling stories as she walked with them along the well-beaten tracks. Often they would go nature spotting, looking for the deer amongst the clumps of mixed woodland, and listening for the different species of bird that dwelt there. Kieran rolled his dice and moved his counter up a level for safety, away from the coiling snake. "My turn," announced Bronwyn. "I know it's your turn," said Kieran, handing over the shaker. "But I'm going to win anyway." Bronwyn eagerly rattled the shaker, as if practicing to be a cocktail waitress. She was catching up on her brother. She only had to roll a 6, and she too would be within winning distance. She released the dice. It shot out and disappeared across the room. She leapt up and ran after it. "It's a 6!" she shrieked. "How do we know that?" said Kieran. "I haven't touched it. Come and look." Kieran came over to inspect the runaway dice. "Oh, pooh," he said. Bronwyn went into a giggling fit. "You said pooh!" She fell on the floor, laughing. She didn't stop laughing. Siobhan watched her, smiling. Then she crept over there on all fours and pounced. She started tickling Bronwyn all over. "There's something very wrong with this child," she said. "She needs to be dealt with. She has a fit of the giggles." Bronwyn could hardly breathe now. "She's going bright red. She needs oxygen." "Stop!" squealed Bronwyn. "I'm not doing anything," teased Siobhan, still tickling her. Eventually she stopped. Bronwyn lay on the floor, gasping for air, but grinning broadly. What's more, 3 minutes later, she beat her brother at snakes and ladders. The rain was still falling, and the wind still blowing. "What can we do now?" asked Bronwyn. "Play another game?" suggested Siobhan. "Which one?" "Well, there I might have a surprise for you." She stood up and left the room. The children looked at each other. She was back in a minute with a big parcel in her hand. "What is it?" asked Ken. She handed it to him. "A present for me?" "It's for all of you," said Siobhan. Ken tore open the tissue paper wrapping. "Cluedo! What's that?" "It's a murder mystery game. You have to solve the clues in order to find out who the murderer is." "Cool!" exclaimed Karen. "Do you want to play it?" asked Siobhan. There was a unanimous vote from all of them. They unpacked it and set up the board. "It's like a house," said Bronwyn. "That's right, a big mansion house, rather like this one. You're the guests, and your host has been horribly murdered." Kieran performed a dramatic interpretation of someone being killed and threw himself prostrate on the floor. "Just like that," said Siobhan. The wind and rain had eased slightly by the time the game had finished. They had loved it. It was the best game they had played, according to Ken. It was fantastically exciting, Kieran had said. Bronwyn had liked the little murder weapons best. The whole thing had captured their imaginations brilliantly. Later that evening, after Siobhan had helped her with her homework, Bronwyn lay on her bed and wrote in her diary, "I love Cluedo." She then went on to describe exactly why. "You have to solve clues. It's great fun. And I beat Kieran again. Siobhan said I would make a good detective one day." There was a knock on the door, and Siobhan looked in. "Are you ready for bed?" Bronwyn was in her pyjamas. "Good girl." She walked over to the window and closed the curtains. "In you hop," she said breezily. Bronwyn climbed in under the covers, putting her diary under the pillow. "What were you writing about?" "Cluedo, because Cluedo makes me happy." Siobhan smiled. "What makes you happy?" asked Bronwyn. Siobhan stuck out a finger and wiggled the girl's nose. "You," she said. "You make me happy." You and your brothers.
Why?
Siobhan sighed slightly. Because you're such lovely children. It's a privilege looking after you. Bronwyn threw her arms around her nanny.
I love you,
she said. Siobhan kissed her. I love you too, she replied.
Chapter 6. 24 years later. Bronwyn paused at Ken's door. She knew he was in the bathroom. She went in. His bag was on the floor by the window. She went over and opened it up. She rummaged around until she found what she was looking for, a pocket-sized bottle of Irish whiskey. She sighed. It was full now, but it would be empty by the end of their stay. A pang of despair hit her in the gut. What are you doing? She stood up quickly, dropping the bottle back in the bag. Nothing. The contents of my bag aren't any of your business, Bron, and nor the contents of that bottle. I wasn't looking at that bottle. Ken raised his eyebrows. Bronwyn looked at the floor. You were snooping is what you were doing. You wanted to see what my tipple was. I know you've got a problem. So do you, Miss Cancer Stick. Don't start preaching to me. Maybe we can help each other. Maybe you can mind your own business. Bronwyn left the room. Ken sat down on the bed. He looked over at his bag. He stared at it for some time. His heart thumped away inside his chest. Sweat broke out all over him. He squeezed his eyes shut. His body trembled. Just hold off for now, he told himself. You don't need it. But he couldn't rest. He was too agitated to even lie down. He didn't want to be in his room. It brought back too many memories. Kieran's face suddenly flashed into his mind. He tried to push it away for now, but it wouldn't budge. His brother was laughing. He had a drink in his hand, probably Guinness. That's what he liked best. Kieran was never happier than when he had a drink in his hand. He seemed to come alive. His personality would expand, and he would become jovial and funny. But Ken realized his brother had a drinking problem when he was staying with him one summer. One thing he noticed was the lack of alcohol in the house, and the fact that his brother drank only soft drinks in his presence. But at the same time, the rank odor of alcohol seeping through pores was very apparent. He had not wanted to say anything. And then one night he had caught his brother red-handed, swigging a bottle of vodka in the bathroom. Kieran had broken down in tears. He knew he was an alcoholic. He had been suffering from depression for 3 years. They talked into the small hours about many things, including Kieran's difficulty in forming relationships with women, his lack of self-confidence, trouble finding a job, etc. His life seemed in tatters. Now, sitting on the bed, Ken felt like producing a checklist of his own, except that it wouldn't quite be his own. It would be his brother's as well. He could relate now to everything Kieran had talked about that night. It felt as though he were following his brother into the abyss. 2 minutes later he was unscrewing the whiskey with trembling hands and pouring it down his throat. Chapter 6. Bronwyn opened her eyes. It was dark. She needed the toilet. She heard Mark snoring quietly beside her. She slid out of the bed and tiptoed across the door. It was dark in the corridor as well, but the skylights were letting in dim light from a crescent moon. She reached the toilet and locked the door behind her. She lifted the lid and sat down, yawning. The linoleum felt cold on her bare feet. She was still half asleep. When she was finished, she stood up and flushed it away. She washed her hands and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She smelt her hair. It stank of smoke. Nathan was right. She desperately needed to quit. There was a sudden light knock on the door. "It's me. I'm just finished. Hold on a sec." She dried her hands on a towel, unlocked the door and walked out. "There you go, She stopped. She was speaking to nobody. She looked up and down the length of the corridor. She'd put the light on along this one. How bizarre, she thought. She could have sworn she heard a knock. She turned off the bathroom light and began walking back to her room. As she passed the old nursery, she noticed that the door was open. The room was dark, though, but it had been closed when she'd passed it a moment ago. She looked in. "Hello?" Silence. She pulled the door closed and continued on back to her room. As she turned onto her corridor,
She noticed that the door to the stairs was also standing open. She closed that one as well. A few paces on, and she stopped yet again. Ken's door was open. What is it with doors tonight, she thought. She quietly pulled Ken's door shut. She almost expected her own door to be open, but it wasn't. She slept back into bed, pulled the covers over her, and fell asleep. She had no idea how long it was before she woke up again, still in darkness. But it wasn't silent. She could hear Ken next door. He was crying. She lay listening to him sob for 5 minutes before she couldn't stand it any more. She got up and tiptoed to his room. She knocked lightly on his door and entered. "Ken?" There was a sharp rustling of bedclothes, as if she'd startled him. "Who's that?" "It's me." He sighed heavily. "What do you want?" "I heard you crying." "Sorry, did I wake you up?" "Yes, but that's not why I came through." He turned on his bedside light. He hadn't unpacked. His clothes were still in his bag, and the ones he'd been wearing were tossed casually over a chair. He lay looking at her. She looked at him. "You must feel as rotten as I do," she said. "I'm sure." She smiled faintly. "Do you want to talk about it?" He looked at his watch. "It's 2 o'clock, Bron. Just let me get back to sleep. I'll be fine tomorrow." She didn't move. "Please?" She sighed and nodded. "I'm just next door if you change your mind, okay?" "I know where you are," he replied. Bronwyn slept for another 2.5 hours before something woke her up again. God damn it, she thought. She hated fractured sleep. It was something she suffered from quite often. Her doctor told her it was stress-induced. She could hear thumping now, coming from somewhere out in the corridor, a repetitive bump, bump, bump. She threw the covers off her, angrily, and got up to see what it was. She wouldn't get back to sleep with that noise. She stormed out into the corridor. It was the door to the stairs again. It was standing wide open, knocking against the wall, obviously with the aid of some draught. "I bloody closed that," she said to herself. She walked purposefully down to the end and pulled it shut. No sooner had she done that than another bumping sound began somewhere else. "Are you kidding me?" she thought. She reluctantly began to hunt down the source of this second noise. The search took her back to the bathroom corridor. The nursery door was still closed. It was coming from the far end, from Siobhan's room. Bronwyn made her way down there. The door was ajar. A strong breeze came from inside. She went in. The curtains over the alcove window were billowing into the room. This was because the window was open. Who opened this? It's cold enough up here as it is. She tried to close it now, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed down as hard as she could. What the hell was wrong with it? She went and switched on the light. Then she laughed. There was a book wedged in underneath it. She removed it and closed the window. She tossed the book onto the bed and walked out. That better be the end of the noises, she thought. The end of the noises, maybe, but not the end of the mysterious door phenomenon. Bronwyn stopped short when she saw it. The nursery door stood wide open, with a light on inside. There was not a soul about. "What is going on around here?" she muttered. "Bronwyn?" She physically jumped. "Jesus, Mark! You scared the shit out of me." "Sorry. What are you doing up?" "I can't sleep properly. Besides, these doors keep opening." "Are you okay?" She screwed up her face. "No, Mark, I'm not actually up. I'm uptight. I hate being back here. I'm very tired, I've had a stressful evening, and now I keep being woken up." "What time is it?" "Coming up for 5:15. In which case, there's no way I'm getting up. It's some ungodly hour for breakfast." "You don't need breakfast anyway. You just have black coffee and cigarettes." "Well, I'm not getting up for that either." Mark chuckled. Bronwyn leaned against the door frame. "I don't want to be in this house tomorrow. I need to get out. I'll take Ken. We'll go to Colston, do some shopping. Do you want to come?" "I'll stay here. I think you need to spend some time alone with your brother." Chapter 7. It was a clear, sunny morning, but still cold. Bronwyn, wrapped in a jacket, was seated once again on the swing bench in the garden with her cigarettes and coffee. She was thinking about the crying woman on the moor. It had been so strange. And who was it? Hell, it might even be her out there by the time this weekend was over. She sipped the hot instant coffee and smoked her cigarette. Her father had real coffee beans, but she was used to instant. It's what she usually drank. What a night, she thought. She had a good notion to nail those doors shut. She wouldn't be able to cope with another fractured night of sleep. It was 11 o'clock. She and Ken were going to drive into Colston for some retail therapy and a bite of lunch. They would go in her car. She took another sip of coffee. A sudden strong wave of nausea passed over her. Her stomach turned over. She retched and then flung herself forward, vomiting into the grass. It was 11:45 when they set off. The drive to Colston was a long stretch of minor road, with very few bends, but it passed through beautiful countryside, country she hadn't seen for a long time. She had come this way many times, sitting in the back seat of a car with her school uniform and satchel. "What do you fancy for lunch?" she asked her brother. He shrugged. "Not fussed," he said. They parked in the centre of town. Bronwyn put 3 hours' worth in the meter. "I can pop back if necessary," she said. There was a newsagent's right across the street. "Do you need to get some cigarettes?" asked Ken. "Yeah. Are you buying them for me?" "Oh yes, that's right. I had forgotten. I knew you would. That's why I was reminding you." He bought her 2 packs of Mayfair. "What do you want to do first? Shop or eat?" "I'm not very hungry at the moment," said Ken. "We'll do a bit of shopping first." They found a mall with several different retailers and wandered around for about an hour, looking in various shops. Bronwyn bought some perfume in one store and then found herself transfixed by jewellery in another. In fact, she spent so long looking at it that Ken eventually got bored and said he was going next door to look at shoes. It was a pearl necklace that had caught her eye. She was not into pearls herself, but even so, she couldn't stop looking at them. It was unlike her to pay any kind of attention to pearls. Siobhan's necklace had been similar to this one, although the pearls on hers had been smaller and more delicate. Bronwyn felt a sudden pang in her heart. She suddenly became aware of somebody standing behind her. She saw the woman's vague reflection in the glass cabinet. She turned, but they must have just slipped away because there was nobody there. She quickly left the store and went in search of Ken. She found him trying on a pair of trainers. "Sorry about that," she said. "Well, now you have to wait for me." He wriggled his feet in the shoes. Or maybe not. They walked back through the mall. As they passed a baby shop, they saw a heavily pregnant woman with a pram and a toddler looking in the window. Ken watched her. "God, what I wouldn't give," he said. "Meaning?" "Meaning I wish she was mine." "Oh, come on, Ken. All couples argue. You don't need to start looking for somebody else." No, I'm not looking for somebody else. I wish that was me and Anna." He looked at his sister. "Bronwyn." She had stopped walking. Instead, she was staring at the woman, her eyes slightly glazed. "What's wrong?" "I don't feel well." "Do you need to sit down?" "I'm going to be sick." And then before she knew it, she had thrown up. Ken led her over to a bench. "Just wait there. I'm going to find someone to clean that up." Bronwyn looked back towards the pregnant woman. She was watching Bronwyn now. She turned away. What was wrong? Ken came back. "Do you want to go home?" "No, I'll be fine. I was sick earlier on as well. I can't explain it." "Maybe you're pregnant." "Oh, ha. They went in search for somewhere to eat. "I'll just have something light," said Bronwyn. They couldn't work out where to go. They pottered around looking in various windows. "We may as well just pick somewhere, Ken." "Fine." He looked around. He saw a cafe on the small side street. The Petit Pain Cafe, it was called. "That'll do." As they crossed the road, Bronwyn was looking at the name. "Why do I recognize that?" she said. But Ken didn't hear her. They entered. A waitress showed them over to a small table by the window. "Will this be okay?" "It's perfect, thank you," said Ken. Bronwyn was looking around her as she sat down. "This place is so familiar to me." "Well, maybe we were here before." "Do you want soup?" "What?" "Do you want soup? It might be gentle on your stomach." "Yes," she replied. Ken studied the menu. "Oh, look, French onion soup. I haven't had that in years. I always liked the way you got the piece of bread in that with the cheese." He grinned at her. But she wasn't looking at him. She was still looking around her with a puzzled look on her face. Ken shook his head. "It's your birthday soon, isn't it?" She snapped her head around. What? Wake up, Bronwyn. No, that's it. It was somebody's birthday. That's when we were here. And then it came back to her in a flash. Everything. She closed her eyes. You feeling sick again? Asked Ken. She shook her head. What's the matter then? I remember. Remember what? Siobhan brought us here for your birthday. You were 6. Ken sat back in his chair. So she did. He looked around him now as well. I'll be damned. We need to go and eat somewhere else. I can't stay here. Her right hand was shaking. Why do we need to eat somewhere else? Because I'm going to cry if I stay here any longer. She started hyperventilating. Shit, I need a cigarette. Just wait a minute. Explain to me what's going through your head at the moment. Siobhan died after your 6th birthday, Ken. That was the last time... She put a hand over her mouth. That was the last time we laughed and had fun with her. Bronwyn burst into tears. Ken reached across the table and took her hand. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He stroked her hand. I'm sorry, I had completely forgotten. I just miss her, Ken. A huge lump was forming in Ken's throat. I miss her too. Do you want to go somewhere else? She couldn't answer him. He waited for her to stop crying. Eventually she managed to pull herself together. I'm okay, she told her brother. I'm okay. I'm just very emotionally confused. I don't know how to feel half the time. Being back here is making it all the more confusing. I'm trying to sort things out in my head this weekend. Part of me wants to remember, and part of me doesn't. There's a part of me that wants to go back to Dublin right now and try and forget all about it. But I know that's not really what I want. What do you want? Asked Ken softly. I think what I really want is to know the truth. She looked at her brother. I want to know who killed her, Ken. And I want to know why. I want some answers. We never got to go to the funeral, so we never got the opportunity to say goodbye to her. Ken fought back his own tears now. But coming back here, I don't know, it just feels like she's still in the house. Her energy, I mean. You're not meaning her ghost is... No, Ken, I'm just saying... I don't know what I'm saying. But there were odd things happening last night. Doors seemed to keep opening by themselves. I went to the toilet at one point, and I could have sworn that somebody knocked at the door. But when I came out, there was nobody there. She sighed. But like I said, I'm emotionally drained and confused. She raised her finger and signaled to the waitress. A large, please. White wine? Certainly, madam. Anything for you, sir? A beer, please. And can we have 2 French onion soups? Right away. I need to go and wash my face, said Bronwyn. I'll be back in a minute. She went to the ladies and ran a basin full of water. She splashed her face several times. Like the night before, she examined herself in the mirror. As she did so, her gaze was drawn to the condom machine behind her. Without thinking what she was doing, she fished in her wallet and removed £2 coins, then fed them into the slot. She pulled the handle, retrieved the 2 condoms, and slipped them back into her pocket. Then she rejoined her brother in the cafe. Chapter 8. 20 minutes later, Ken was finishing up his French onion soup. Bronwyn ate a little slower on account of her funny tummy. She was so pretty, Bronwyn was saying. Ken nodded. How did she wear her hair? He asked. I just remember I liked touching it or playing with it. She usually wore it down. Occasionally she'd wear it up, but never very successfully. She was funny that way. Casual beauty. I never saw her wearing makeup. She didn't need any. Anna wears quite a lot. Bronwyn smiled. Because she needs it? No, he sighed. Let's not go down that road. Bronwyn giggled. Do you think she had a boyfriend? Asked Ken. She never talked about one. Well, she might not have in front of us. She talked about other things with us. Bronwyn had stopped eating suddenly. She was staring at her bowl. But maybe she kept secrets. Ken paused and looked at her. There was something about the way she said it. Why do you say that? Because she must have known. Known what? Her killer. Ken almost bit his tongue. He stopped chewing. We lived in a quiet community. Quiet and close-knit. It wasn't a mugging. We are 10 miles from Colston. Maybe in a city you're going to get a random robbery, someone who doesn't know their victim. But 9 out of 10 murder cases, Ken, the victim knew their killer. Bronwyn picked up her spoon. You're saying Siobhan was killed by someone in the village? Well, unless someone drove 10 miles out of Colston because they wanted to drink in a nice little village pub and then take a beautiful girl for a romantic walk on the moor and strangle her. Didn't Dad say she had a friend in Colston? Maybe she did, but she never told us that. So I say again, maybe she kept secrets. Well, what then? What's the point in maybes? There's nothing we can do about it, Bronwyn. Bronwyn thought for a moment. Think back to that last evening. I was saying it was all fun and laughs, but I remember distinctly she was definitely not herself that night. Of course she was. No, she wasn't. Because I remember asking her if she was okay. And I remember what she said, too. Let's not go down that road. I remember because I had never heard that expression before. So what do you think was wrong with her? I have no idea, Ken. If I knew that, maybe things would be different now. Okay, so she was upset. She could have been upset about anything. It's not necessarily linked with her death. She was a happy person, Ken. That was her nature. When did you ever see her upset? I can't remember. She wasn't. She must have been up some point. Well, not in front of us. Something must have been bothering her so much that she was gloomy even on your birthday. Ken looked uncomfortable. I don't like where you're going with this, Bronwyn. It's giving me the creeps. Can we not just talk about happy things? Wouldn't it make you happy to find out what really happened to her? Well, yes, but what are the chances of that? The case has remained unsolved for over 20 years. It's lost now. Not necessarily. Oh, come on, Bronwyn. What are you going to do? Try and solve a murder in the course of a weekend? Don't mock me. Penn picked up his beer. Bronwyn finished her soup. I see you found your old diary. Have you been reading it? I'm sorry? Asked Bronwyn, looking confused. I found your old diary in Siobhan's room this morning. You left it lying on the bed. Bronwyn's mouth dropped open. My diary, she said. You mean the one I wrote when I was a girl? Ken nodded. That's impossible. Well, it's there. Bronwyn stared at him. That was propping open the window last night. Which window? The window in Siobhan's room. Ken frowned. That's funny. How? I haven't seen that in years. I thought I threw it away. She stared absolutely dumbfounded at her brother. That's extraordinary. Extraordinary that it should be propping open a window after all these years. She shook her head. It doesn't make any sense. What doesn't make sense is what you were doing at 5:30 this morning in Siobhan's room. I wasn't in Siobhan's room at 5:30 this morning. I closed the window at about 5:15. I was back in bed by 5:30. No, you weren't, Bronwyn. I beg your pardon? I got up at 5:30 to go to the toilet. As I came out, I distinctly heard a woman crying in Siobhan's room. There's only one woman in this house, Bronwyn. Bronwyn was looking at him in a very strange way. Ken, I was in bed at 5:30 this morning. I know that for a fact. Ken looked slightly stunned. He sat back in his chair. He said nothing for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was almost a whisper. I don't believe in ghosts, he said. Chapter 9. They walked back to the car in silence, both thinking their own thoughts. There were still 15 minutes left on the meter. The drive back was also in silence. They arrived in Cormac at around 4:30. Let's not say anything about this, said Bronwyn. What would I say? Asked Ken. When they arrived back at the house, Ken went straight inside. Bronwyn went into the garden. She stood under the big plum tree they had, which always produced fine crops every autumn. The branches were now virtually bending under their weight. She reached up and detached one, gently biting into it. It was perfectly ripe. Her father would be picking them soon. She looked out towards the low hills on Farndale Moor. Where are you? She muttered. What? She turned. Ken was standing behind her. I was talking to myself. He was holding her diary in his hand. He gave it to her. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe she did keep secrets." Then he turned and went back to the house. Bronwyn sat down on the swing bench and put the diary on her lap. She took her time over the plum, savouring its soft, juicy flesh with the occasional sour tang. There were butterflies in her stomach. The last piece of plum disappeared. She looked at the book in her lap. She didn't want to open it. She fingered the corners. The cover was pink with birds and flowers dotted all over it. She lifted it back. On the first page, in big bold lettering, was her name, Bronwyn Doyle, and underneath, "This is my happy diary." Bronwyn allowed herself a smile, but no more. She couldn't read any more, not without a drink and cigarettes. She got back in the car and drove to the Giant's pub on the edge of the village. It was almost deserted when she entered. One man sat at the bar with his back to her. She went up and ordered a large Pinot Grigio. "Have you got a beer garden?" she asked. "Just out the back." She went outside to a pleasant little seating area that backed onto a patch of woodland and sat down under a heat lamp. She took out her cigarettes, opened up the diary, and began to read. "My name is Bronwyn Doyle. I am 8 years old, and this diary that I am going to keep will be full of things that make me happy. I live in a big house on the edge of a moor. We have a nanny called Siobhan. I love Siobhan." Bronwyn took a generous swig of wine, then pulled hard on her cigarette. She knew this was going to be difficult. She read on. "I like eating sweeties. They make me happy. Siobhan takes us to the shop every Friday and we buy sweeties. I like toffee. It is nice and chewy. Siobhan likes sherbets. She always makes a funny face when she eats them, which makes me laugh. I want Siobhan to always be my nanny." Bronwyn's hand shook as she took a drag from her cigarette. She wanted to cry again. There was so much innocence here. Innocence before the storm, before it all fell apart. She wished she could go back, suck those toffees again, which she still loved, watch Siobhan's face contort as she reacted to the sour taste. It was all so much fun. Her life was no longer the happy-go-lucky, carefree existence she had experienced with Siobhan. Now it was all work and no play. Her doctor was concerned about her health. As a child she had a healthy appetite for food. Now she survived mainly on coffee and cigarettes. She suffered from stress and depression, for which she took medication every morning. Mark was concerned about her too. Their sex life had suffered due to long hours, exhaustion and mental fatigue. She was now merely a ruin of the girl who had written this diary. She read on for at least half an hour, about stories Siobhan had told them, about the walks they used to take, and about visits to Mrs. Randall's bakery. She turned another page. "I love hearing people snore." Bronwyn almost sprayed wine everywhere. This time she laughed out loud. What a bizarre thing. She had to read this. "It is very funny. I can hear my brother snoring next door. Once I sneaked out of my room because I wanted to know if Kieran snored. He was snoring very loudly. I even went to see if Siobhan snored, but her snoring sounded different. It sounded like she was moaning, like when you have a sore tummy. Maybe she was sick." Bronwyn laughed again. "Excuse me." She started. She hadn't heard the man come out. He was the man at the bar. He had a pint in his hand. "It took me a while to realize who you were." "Have we met?" she asked. "Quite some time ago. I doubt you even remember me." The man was perhaps in his 50s, with hair that was going grey around the temples. "My name is Lucius Mayer. I was the constable here when you were very young." "Oh, my God," said Bronwyn. She stood up and embraced him. "What are you doing here?" "Hoping I might get another chance to talk to you." They ordered more drinks and basked in the warmth of the heat lamp. "When I read about your mother's death in the obituaries, I thought it might be a good opportunity to meet you with you. However, I didn't think the funeral itself would be a good place to catch up. Then I wasn't sure whether you'd gone home or what you had done. But no, you're still here. I'm still here, but only till Monday. Then I go back to Dublin. In which case, we don't have much time. As you may or may not be aware, the case of Siobhan Bailey's murder is still open, although for now it's been put on hold due to lack of evidence. Bronwyn felt her shoulders tensing. I've been heading this inquiry for so long, it feels almost personal. I'm Chief of Police in Colston now. I have been there for several years. I came to investigate when your brother died. As you know, his fall was nothing suspicious. He had a lot of alcohol in his system, and drowning was the only cause of death that we could find. Why are you telling me this, Lucius? Your mother's death makes it 3. 3 deaths that have occurred in your family. 2 of them in the space of 3 years. People die. It's not uncommon. True. But what's a little more uncommon is 3 people dying on almost identical dates. Bronwyn stared at him. What are you talking about? Siobhan Bailey died on the 15th of November, 1984. 3 years ago, your brother Kieran died on the 16th of November. This is the 21st of November. Your mother died just over a week ago. Bronwyn put a hand over her mouth. Jesus, you're right. It never clicked. No. Yeah, well, it didn't escape my attention. And that's why I had to come back again. But you're not suggesting... She shook her head. My mother died of a self-inflicted overdose, Lucius. An accident, just like my brother. So why do you still feel the need to come back on something that is probably nothing more than a huge coincidence? He took a deep breath. A hunch? Or maybe just desperation. Lucius looked at the ashtray in front of her. I wouldn't understand that. I want to see an end to it too. But maybe it's not possible. I was talking about this with Ken. That seems to be his opinion. Lucius was still staring at the ashtray. I haven't had a cigarette in years, he said. Bronwyn smiled. Don't bother starting again. She drank her wine. Are you sure it's just a punch? There's nothing else that stands out as odd. Lucius shook his head. Bronwyn sighed. Did you hope there was? Of course. Mayor nodded. I'm sorry. I wish there was. But maybe you could help me there. Me? How? By thinking hard. By telling me everything that you can possibly remember about that day. The day she went missing. Lucius, it's been 20 years. How can I do that? She paused. The only thing I have just remembered is Ken's birthday. Siobhan took us out for dinner that night. It was the day before she died. She was different that night. Go on. You see, Siobhan always smiled. There wasn't a single time I ever saw her not smiling, except that night. When she did, it was forced. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, let's not go down that road. Mary was scribbling away furiously on the back of a beer mat. And this was the 14th? Yes. Okay. Do you know what hypnotic regression is? I've heard of it. It's where you regress people into past events. Would you be willing to do that? Bronwyn paused only for a moment. Yes. Would you be willing to come back with me now to Colston Police Station? There's a woman there called Dr. Louise Harper. She's a hypnotherapist. She helps victims of crime. Bronwyn exhaled smoke. She hesitated. I don't get much time to think about this, do I? She's based in Omaha, but she dots around, basically to wherever she's needed. There's a case she's working on in Colston at the moment, but I know she'll do this for me if I ask. Bronwyn nodded. Can I finish my wine first? If you do that, I'll give her a call. Dr. Harper met them in a small room on the 3rd floor of the police headquarters in Colston. She was perhaps in her mid-40s, with blonde hair tied in a neat little ponytail at the back and wearing a suit. Louise, thank you for this. Can I introduce you to Bronwyn Doyle? Pleasure. Have a seat. Bronwyn lowered herself nervously into the big leather armchair. Just try and relax, Bronwyn. The Chief Inspector is going to stay and take notes, if that's okay? Absolutely, replied Bronwyn, looking at him. Okay. Just settle back in the chair and make yourself as comfortable as possible. I want you to look at this for me. On the table in front of her was a series of little metal balls hanging on a stand. Dr. Harper set the balls in motion, and they began bouncing off each other, back and forth, back and forth. Bronwyn focused her eyes on one of them. "Keep watching them, for just now," said Harper. Bronwyn did so. After a while she found she could barely keep her eyes open. "All right. I want you to close your eyes now." "Good. Now I want you to clear your mind of any recent thoughts or worries. Just let yourself drift." Lucius watched Bronwyn in the chair. After a matter of minutes, Harper spoke again. "Okay, let's begin, shall we?" Siobhan gently shook the girl awake. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for school." She pushed back a curl from Bronwyn's cheek. Bronwyn opened her eyes. "Do I have to go to school today?" she murmured. Siobhan smiled. "Yes, you do," she replied. "Come on." Bronwyn grudgingly pushed back the covers and almost slid out of bed. "I'm too tired." "You wake up once you've had a shower." "Are you feeling better this morning?" Bronwyn asked her. Siobhan tried to smile. "I was just tired last night, that's all. I'm fine." Bronwyn shook her head. "No, you're not." "It's time for school," said Siobhan. Bronwyn showered and changed and went downstairs to the kitchen. Her father was just coming in from the feeding the geese. He said nothing to her. She went into the bottom cupboard and got out the cereal. There wasn't much left. "Are there any more cornflakes, Dad? Did you buy them?" he asked irritably. "No." "Well, then there won't be, will there?" But nothing, Bronwyn. Have some toast instead. I've got a busy day ahead of me. I haven't got time to worry about the details of your breakfast." He left the room. As Bronwyn put bread on top of the stove, Siobhan appeared. "Have you got everything you want?" "There's no more cereal." Siobhan frowned. "I bought some the other day." She opened one of the top cupboards. "Here you go." She brought out a fresh pack of cornflakes and poured them into a bowl for Bronwyn. "I'm sorry I was a bit grumpy with you upstairs," she said. "It's okay," replied Bronwyn quietly. "You're right. There are things on my mind. I just can't discuss them with you, sweetie, okay?" "I might help if you talked about them," said Bronwyn, taking the bowl over to the table. Siobhan smiled sadly. "Yes, I know." She suddenly stopped and put a hand to her stomach. She swayed slightly. "What's wrong?" I don't feel very well." She sat down rather heavily on a chair. "Maybe you need to eat something," suggested Bronwyn. Siobhan shook her head. "No." She closed her eyes. Suddenly she retched. "Excuse me," she said, and rushed from the room. Just as she was finishing her cereal, Seamus came back in again to make himself coffee. "What are you doing today?" she asked him. "Don't talk with your mouth full," he said. And then, "Conservation work, that's what I'm doing." "Do you like that?" He shrugged. "It's my job." He stirred his coffee. "How's school? Are you working hard?" Bronwyn nodded. "Good. It's important to work hard." "Do you work hard?" "Always." Siobhan appeared in the doorway, looking a bit pale. "Seamus, I'm not very well this morning." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Are you all right to take the children to school?" She nodded. "Mrs. Lamb is bringing them back this afternoon, so just take it easy for the rest of the day, okay?" Siobhan nodded again. "I'll be around most of the time anyway." Bronwyn finished off her cereal, had some toast and went to brush her teeth. She went out to the car and waited for Siobhan. Nathan was in the garden with his own clothes, looking like the suave 15-year-old he was. He was home for a few days' study leave from boarding school. He'd been out with them for Ken's birthday dinner. For some reason he was looking awfully pleased with himself this morning. "Hi, Bron," he said almost smugly. "What's wrong with you?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" She giggled at him. "You're acting funny. What have you done?" He grinned at her now. "Nothing. Well, I might just have procured myself a new girlfriend." Bronwyn fell about laughing. "What's so funny?" "You," she said. "What? You think your big brother can't get a girlfriend?" "Is she very sexy?" asked Bronwyn, still laughing. "Grow up, Bronwyn." Siobhan came out with Ken and Kieran tagging along behind. "Are you ready, Bronwyn?" she asked. "I'm ready." She opened the door and got in. "Morning, Siobhan," said Nathan.
"Morning.
"Are you busy studying today?" "Yeah, unfortunately."
I'll see you later."
Mayer wrote something down on his pad. Bronwyn was still under. It was working like a dream. She was remembering everything so clearly, as if it had just been yesterday. But so far nothing much was jumping out at him.
"Let's go back now to the dinner," said Dr. Harper. "I want you to see everything as clearly as you've seen it before. Concentrate on Siobhan. What's she doing? What are her mannerisms?"
Siobhan was drinking Coke with a piece of lemon in it and several chunks of ice. She was staring into space as she drank, something she had been doing most of the evening. She had been finding it very difficult to engage with the children. Bronwyn, who was sitting opposite, had noticed this change in her. She looked awfully down in the mouth. At one point she noticed that Siobhan was shuggling her knee up and down in what seemed an agitated manner. "Are you okay?" Siobhan patted her hand.
"Let's not go down that road, sweetie. Just eat your burger."
She picked up her drink again. Her hands were shaking so much that the ice cubes were clinking away furiously. When pudding came, the waitress brought over a cake Siobhan had pre-ordered. It had 6 lighted candles on it. But even then, Siobhan only managed a weak smile.
"Make a wish," she said.
Ken smiled.
"I wish that Siobhan will be our nanny for at least another 2 years.
He blew the candles out in one big puff. Siobhan looked away, as if she was looking at something else. But Bronwyn noticed that she quickly wiped a tear from her eye. She was very quiet on the drive home. When they got in at 9 o'clock, Siobhan took them up the stairs. Nathan went to his room. Siobhan went to run a bath for herself. Later that night, Bronwyn went to the toilet. As she came out, she heard Siobhan crying in her room. She knocked gently on the door. "Who is it?"
"It's Bronwyn."
She opened the door and looked in. Siobhan was sitting on her bed in her nightclothes. Her hair was dishevelled, her eyes red raw.
"What is it, sweetie? You're upset."
Siobhan wiped her eyes.
"Yes, I'm upset. Why?"
Siobhan didn't answer for a moment.
"Sometimes even adults do silly things," she said. "What did you do?"
Siobhan's tone was almost sharp. "Oh, Bronwyn, I can't explain. Just go to bed, please." Bronwyn closed the door. Dr. Harper brought Bronwyn out of the trance. She was crying.
"Would you like some water?"
Bronwyn nodded. Lucius fetched her some water from a cooler in the corner.
"These types of sessions can be very difficult because you're remembering things the conscious brain doesn't necessarily want to. But you did extremely well."
Bronwyn sipped her water.
"I've got a headache," she said.
"I've got some paracetamol in my bag," said Harper. She gave her one. Bronwyn looked at the time.
"I better be getting back."
"I'll drive you," said Mayer. As they were walking down the corridor, Bronwyn said, "Something there struck me as odd." "What was that?" asked Mayer.
"Her being sick."
"What's odd about that?"
"Nothing, only I've been sick twice today."
Mayer drove her back to the pub. It was now 6:30. The night air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, and lights glowed in the cottage windows. Mayer gave her his card. "I want you to give me a call if there's anything else you remember." She took it from him, nodding. "I will." Mayer waved his pad at it. "This is new information, so thank you. She was upset about something she'd done. We just need to try and find out what that was." "How do we do that?" Lucius smiled sadly. "I'll have a think." Bronwyn didn't want to go back home. She wanted to walk. She stuck her hands in her pockets, pulled up her jacket collar, and started to stroll slowly along the pavement, heading towards the main street. She passed curtained windows with warm light seeping out to the edges, past windows with little model ships and wooden seagulls. It was a beautiful village. There was no denying that. But what of the villagers and their way of life? The recession had hit hard, especially in Dublin. She could only imagine what it might do to a remote community like Cormac. She couldn't understand why people would want to live somewhere like this, where the pace of life was so slow you might as well clock watch for the duration. Bronwyn had enjoyed it, but then she hadn't known anything else. And I suppose, she thought, some of the people here don't know anything else. There was some merit in living life slowly, she thought. For one thing, there wouldn't be the stress and tension that comes from working in a fast-paced office environment like hers. Her mind began to drift onto more present matters now. Siobhan. She had forgotten the crying incident. She had never seen that side of Siobhan before that night. In the 5 years that she had been there, she had never once snapped at Bronwyn. And what of the vomiting? It seemed like another extraordinary coincidence. The other thought that was beginning to wriggle its way into her mind was not only implausible, it was stupid. Do ghosts exist? She had never been totally sceptical in the matter, if she was being honest with herself. But she was also fully aware by the power of suggestion and what grief can do to your mind. The thought, although daft, was simple. Was Siobhan trying to come through to her from the other side? Was she reaching out for help from beyond the veil? The doors opening, the diary suddenly appearing like that, the distinct sound of crying coming from Siobhan's old room, all of these were strange incidents in their own right. But was it possible for Siobhan's ghost to make her be physically sick? And why? Because she felt sick the day she died? What did that have to do with her being strangled? She wrinkled her brow. You don't mistake the sound of wind for somebody crying. Or do you? She had heard that woman crying out on the moor. Perhaps that was just wind or seabirds. And then Bronwyn stopped dead. She almost stopped breathing, too. My God, she whispered. Chapter 11. Mrs. Randalls was seated in an armchair in front of the fire with a rug across her legs and a book in her lap when the door knocker rattled. She rose and shuffled through to the front door. Bronwyn Doyle stood on the pavement outside, her hair blowing in the wind. Mrs. Randalls was surprised to see her. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Randalls. I want you to tell me more about the Banshee." Mrs. Randalls handed Bronwyn tea. "It's a horrible night. We're expecting rain later. Sorry, did you want sugar in that?" It's fine," said Bronwyn. Mrs. Randalls lowered herself back into her armchair. "So, you want to know more about the Banshee?" Bronwyn nodded. "Traditional to Ireland? No. Tell me more about our one. Not Banshees in general." "I believe it was Kieran who first heard it," she said. "That would have been, about 20 years ago now. He said he heard a woman crying, didn't he?" "Yes." "You said you'd heard it too. Describe to me what you heard." "Heart-wrenching sobs, tones of anguish, of mental agony." She shivered involuntarily. "It proper put the wind up me." "And when was this?" "Last week, the same night your mother died." "And you say you heard it when Kieran died too?" Mrs. Randalls nodded. "Now, this is very important. Can you remember the exact date on which Kieran first heard the Banshee?" Mrs. Randalls shook her head and frowned. "No." "But now let me think. It was in the autumn, I know that." Bronwyn was nodding. "Your father had his accident the following night. That was in November, most definitely." She mused, glancing into the fire at one point. "Oh, wait a minute. It was the day my granddaughter was born, of course." Mrs. Randalls shook her head and frowned. "Yes, I remember the date. 15th of November, 1985. Bronwyn almost spilled her tea. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." Bronwyn's heart was pounding. The first anniversary of Siobhan's death. "Siobhan," she murmured. "It was her all along. It's not a Banshee. What are you trying to tell us? What haven't we been hearing?" What? Said Mrs. Randalls. Bronwyn now told her everything. Mrs. Randalls sat very still throughout, listening carefully. When Bronwyn had finished, she sat for a while longer in silence. "So, is it possible? Or am I just getting myself worked up?" "Oh, you're not getting yourself worked up, dear," replied Mrs. Randalls, looking at her. "Spirits are trying to communicate with the living all the time. The veil is thinner than you think, child." She stood up and poked at the fire, sending a plume of sparks up the chimney. She put a log on. "Did you know I was a spiritualist?" "No, I had no idea." "Oh, yes. 30 years now. And I'll tell you, my dear, it makes you view the world a lot differently." She sat down again. "I remember Siobhan. A soul like that deserves to be at peace. But what is she trying to tell us?" Mrs. Randalls looked at her in surprise. "Why, who killed her, of course. And why? Isn't that what you want to know?" "Yes." "Well, Siobhan knows that, Bronwyn. She's been trying to tell you for years, but you've been away. Now you're back." Bronwyn stared at the old woman. How do they communicate? And how do I listen?" "Spirits will often communicate through signs. Think of things that have been slightly out of the ordinary since you arrived. Your diary turning up, propped under the window like that. But there's nothing in the diary except my memories, and they were all happy, but that was the point. Then perhaps it's something that you're not seeing at the moment. Something that looks like it's saying one thing, but is actually saying another." "I suppose so." "What about the vomiting?" "Well, that I don't know about, dear. As you say, being sick doesn't seem to have anything to do with being strangled." She chuckled. "We all throw up. But let's not go down that road." She stood up to get some tea. "What did you say?" asked Bronwyn slowly. "I said let's not go down that road. You know, that's the third time that phrase has cropped up today. And Siobhan said it the night before she died." Mrs. Randalls poured more tea into Bronwyn's cup. "Is that a sign?" asked Bronwyn. "It could well be." She resumed her seat. "If there is something in the diary, then how on earth do I find out what it is?" "Have you finished reading it yet?" "No." "Finish it. If there's nothing that jumps out at you, read it again. And remember, you were a child when you wrote it. Things always look different to children. What you wrote back then may mean something different from an adult perspective." Bronwyn nodded. "Is it true that a spirit can possess you?" she asked quietly. "Sometimes. It's not common. They can make you feel things, though, like emotions. They can plant certain thoughts in your head that might make you do something that you maybe didn't think you could do. Nothing negative, mind. I forgot to offer you a biscuit. Would you like one?" Bronwyn waved her hand. "What kind of things can they make you do?" "Oh, well, usually it's just something like remembering to turn off the stove at night, if that's something you often forget, or locking a door, things that help in everyday situations." Bronwyn's mobile suddenly rang. It was Mark. "Hi. Where are you?" "I'm just having a walk." "Well, we're about to get eating in about 15 minutes. "Yeah, okay, Mark, but I can do what I want." "Why am I suddenly the bad guy in all this?" She sighed. "You're not the bad guy. Look, I'll be home in about 10 minutes, all right? I love you." She hung up. "Are you wanted?" Bronwyn smiled. "I'm wanted. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Randalls, and the advice." "You're welcome, child." As Bronwyn was leaving, she suddenly thought of something. Hang on. If Siobhan isn't a Banshee, then why has she been crying before someone is either injured or killed? "Do you want to know my honest opinion?" Bronwyn nodded. "In my opinion, there is something more to these deaths than first meets the eye." When Bronwyn got in, Wolfgang was again in front of the fire in the entrance hall. He wagged his tail a couple of times, but apart from that, didn't move. "You've been out for a while," said Seamus as he entered the living room. "Sorry, I went for a walk after I brought Ken back. At least I'm in time for dinner." It started raining during dinner, as Mrs. Randalls had said. Afterwards they sat in the living room and played Trivial Pursuit. Bronwyn sat next to Mark on the sofa again. Half the time she was discreetly stroking his thigh with her pinky. When it came to her turn, Nathan read out the question. "Where did Lord Melville hide the jewels that he stole from Lady Constance during the 1850s theft? Was it A, a pond, B, a suitcase, or C, a coffin?" Bronwyn thought for a moment and then shrugged. "A pond? It was actually C, a coffin." "Oh well." The household retired to bed at 10 o'clock. Upstairs the rain drummed on the skylights. "Great," said Bronwyn. "More noise." She opened her bedroom door. She stopped. The sight that met her eyes made her heart jump up into her throat. On the floor in front of her, curled into an S, was a pearl necklace. Her breath halted. She stared transfixed, her mind spellbound. And then she heard Mark coming. Quick as a flash, she bent down and swiped up the necklace, shoving it into her pocket. Mark retrieved his wash bag from the room and went to the toilet. As soon as he was gone, she went next door to Ken. "Did you put this in my room?" she asked, holding up the necklace. Ken frowned. "No. Ken, I want you to tell me the truth." "I'm telling you the truth." "This was on the floor in my room, curled into an S." Ken stared at it for a moment, then narrowed his eyes. "That's Mum's," he said. Bronwyn examined it. "How do you know?" I remember her wearing it. Look at the oddly shaped pearl in the middle there. I remember asking her about that once. She said that was what stood out about it." "Okay, so it's Mum's. How did it end up in my room?" "Maybe it's paranormal." "It's not paranormal, Ken. This is a sick joke. And if you did it, you better tell me now. Why would I do that to you? To wind me up, to have a bit of fun with me, just after we'd been talking about the ghosts thing. I'm telling you, for the last time, I didn't put anything in your goddamn room." Bronwyn stormed out, slamming the door behind her. She sat down on her bed, shaking. She dangled the necklace in front of her, as though it were a snake. Then she threw it on top of the chest of drawers. When Mark came back into the room, he found her crying. He closed the door and sat down next to her. He folded her into his arms. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For everything." Bronwyn broke down into a torrent of tears. She grasped at her husband, desperately seeking comfort from something physical, something which she could feel and see. Half an hour passed. They lay on the bed together in each other's arms. "I love you, Mark." "I know." She nudged him in the ribs and smiled. "I don't know how you've put up with me, though. All these years of my moods have driven me to all those appointments. I didn't used to be like this." "I know. You already said that." Mark chuckled. "Bronwyn, I married you because I loved you. Because I saw under that chain-smoking, self-harming, angry young woman that you were. There's something far more innocent and beautiful. I could see someone who was suffering, and I wanted to learn more." "I'd have her run a mile," she said. "Not off all those cigarettes, you wouldn't." Bronwyn giggled. She stroked his cheek. "How long has it been since we had sex?" Mark drew in a breath. "Oh, blimey, that's a hard one. Let me just get my diary." Bronwyn stifled a squeal of hysterics and then jumped on top of him. "What's got into you?" She was kissing him tenderly now, his lips, his cheek, his forehead. "I just want to show my husband how much I love him, how much I need him, and how much I'm gagging for it." Mark burst out laughing. "Shh! We need to keep it down. We don't want anyone to hear." "I don't have any protection on me," he whispered. "Ah, fear not," she said, slipping her hand into her pocket. "I've been a clever girl." Bronwyn laid her head back in the pillows. She was breathing heavily. Mark was on top of her. She could feel him inside her. She could feel the warmth of his body, the powerful but gentle thrusts, and she realized how much she had missed it. "I love you," she said again. "I love you," he replied. He started to push harder. She began to moan. She put her arms around his neck. Her moaning grew louder. "Sweetheart, you know how much I love to hear you moan, but you need to keep it down." And then something happened. Bronwyn made a sudden, sharp outburst of sound, but he knew instantly it was nothing to do with the orgasm. She shoved him backwards with such force that he almost fell off the end of the bed. "What the hell?" Bronwyn almost scrambled onto the floor, grappling for her coat. Mark sat, naked as a baby, staring dumbfounded at his wife, who seemed suddenly to have been possessed. She reached inside the coat and frantically pulled out her diary. She sat on her haunches in the middle of the room, flicking wildly through her book. "What are you doing?" he asked her. In answer, she read out a single passage from her diary. "I even went to see if Siobhan snored, but her snoring sounded different. It sounded like she was moaning, like when you have a sore tummy." Bronwyn looked around at him. "She wasn't snoring, Mark, she was having sex." Chapter 12. Bronwyn put on her dressing gown and paced about the room. Mark sat in bed, feeling a little cheesed off. Sex. Who was she having sex with? We were having sex a moment ago, if I recall. She ignored him. Did she sneak somebody in? No, she can't have. Unless... The side entrance into the garden. She stopped pacing suddenly. Then she ran from the room. Mark shook his head in despair. Bronwyn marched into her brother's room. She flicked on the light. "Ken, get up, I need your help." But he was sitting on the floor by the window. "What are you doing there? Do you know how to knock, Bron?" It was obvious he'd been crying. "Siobhan was having sex with somebody. Good for her. She must have been sneaking somebody in." "What do you mean? You mean she was having sex in the house?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "It's in my diary. I once heard her moaning, but I thought she was snoring. In my hypnosis section, I remembered her saying, 'Even adults do silly things.' The entry in my diary is a late one. It's near the end of the book, which means that's closer to the time Siobhan died. Hang on. Just hold on your horses. What hypnosis section?" Bronwyn explained. "So she was having sex. It's not a crime. It's got something to do with it. I know it has." She then explained about her visit to Mrs. Randall's. "Oh, Jesus, Bronwyn, you need help. Siobhan is not trying to contact you. She's dead. We don't know why, and we're not going to find out why, especially not through some fucking seance. Just hear me out, Ken. Didn't there used to be a secret passage in one of the towers? It was supposed to lead down to the cellars." "A secret passage?" echoed Ken. "Well, not secret. Dad said it was for the servants. It was like another back stairs. It serves every level." "Yes, there is one. It's in the North Tower." "That's near Siobhan's room. What if someone was getting access to the cellar's woods hatch?" "It would have to be unlocked for that to happen." "Well, obviously Siobhan would make sure it was before she went to bed." "Okay, supposing you're right. Why did she end up strangled at the end of all this?" "I don't know." "Well, I tell you what. Why don't you go back to your room and try and figure out exactly why she was murdered? Then once you've done that, come back through and disturb me again." "Ken, bugger off, Bron. It's 11 o'clock. I'm not going searching for some hypothetical peeping Tom just now. Oh, and by the way, keep the noise down next door, would you?" Bronwyn left him on the floor and went back to Mark. She'd go back into bed. The two of them sat in silence for 5 minutes, Mark watching her the whole time. Eventually he said, "What is it, Bronwyn? What's going on?" Bronwyn wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know. Maybe I'm sick in the head. I think Siobhan is trying to speak to me, Mark. I went to see that old woman today, Mrs. Randall's. There's an old mystery that goes back to when we were younger, concerning a Banshee. I think Siobhan is the ghost that's been haunting our family all this time. I think she's trying to tell us who killed her." "Bronwyn." Mark shook his head. "You know, I think you're right." She looked at him. "About being sick." She looked away. "I think you're under a hell of a lot of stress at the moment by coming back here. I'm taking you home tomorrow. And then I'm taking you back to the unit." Bronwyn stared at him. He didn't look at her. "No, Mark, please, I'm fine. You don't need to do that." "Yes, I do." Fresh tears came into Bronwyn's eyes. "Mark!" "I'm sorry, but I think it's the best place for you at the moment. Just until you get your head straight again." The tears poured down Bronwyn's face. "Mark, it happened once. That was a year and a half ago. I'm fine." "No, you're not. Mark, don't talk like this. You're scaring me." "You're scaring yourself, Bronwyn. My mind's settled on the matter. We'll leave after lunch tonight." He rolled over. "Good night." Bronwyn waited until she knew Mark was asleep. Then she slipped out of bed, put on her clothes and left the house. She got in her car and drove away. She headed towards Cormac. Halfway there, she pulled into the side of the road and made a phone call. "Inspector Mayor," said a weary voice. "Lucius, it's Bronwyn. Is everything all right?" Her voice broke. "No." "What is it?" "I just need someone to talk to," she said, sobbing. "Where are you?" "Somewhere between home and Cormac." "Are you in the car?" "Yeah." "Okay, listen. There's an all-night service station between there and Colston. You can't miss it. I'll meet you there. I think they do coffees." Bronwyn wiped her eyes. "Okay." Bronwyn arrived before Mare did. She waited 10 minutes before his car pulled in next to hers. They bought coffee and donuts and sat in Mare's car. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, cradling the hot cup in her hands. "That's no problem. I've got a day off tomorrow anyway. What did you want to talk about?" Bronwyn recalled the strange events of the past 2 days and her thoughts on the matter. Mare listened patiently, nodding now and again. When it came to the part about the sex, he drew in a short breath. He mused on it for a moment. What if the person she was having sex with was someone she shouldn't have been with in the first place? Perhaps another of Seamus's employees. Your father might have frowned on that, and subsequently she could lose her job, or he could lose his. Lucius drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. "This wood hatch you're talking about, where is it exactly?" She thought for a second. "It's right under the kitchen window," she said, blowing on her coffee. It's not the most ideal place to sneak somebody in. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Have you any idea who worked for your father back then?" "Oh, yes. But we only knew them on the first-name terms. There was Jim, who did any odd jobs but for Dad. Then there was... I can't remember his name. But anyway, there was a young man who worked with Dad on conservation matters, and he had a small team behind him. Then there was Bryce, the gamekeeper. All right, so we've got a few possibilities already. What I might do in that case is see if your father still has their details on file somewhere." Bronwyn looked doubtful. "If not, there are other means of tracking them down." He took a bite of his donut and swallowed some coffee. "Okay, so let's assume then that Siobhan was having a relationship with one of your father's employees. They fall out. Siobhan threatens to tell of their affair. Somehow he lures her out onto the moor and strangles her. He takes the necklace and the ring to make it look like a robbery and flees. But in which direction?" Bronwyn sipped hot coffee and stared at the petrol pumps. "We know by the coroner's findings that she was killed any time between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. the previous afternoon." "But we've got no damn witnesses. That's always been the problem. Nothing. Not even any footprints. I mean, there wouldn't be. It was all grass. The pathways were well kept. That was just part of your father's job. No soft mud on them." He sighed. "It's a mystery." He took another sip of coffee. "Lucius, what's your opinion on the other things I was saying? You know, about..." He nodded. "There are 2 ways I can answer that. The first is from a professional perspective, and that would be perhaps her ghost is communicating with you, but because the police work with facts and evidence, I can't use anything of what you're saying to help with this investigation. That would be my professional point of view." He took another bite of his donut. "What's your other one?" asked Bronwyn. He finished his mouthful before answering. "My other one would be from a personal perspective." Again, he took another bite of donut and chewed it in silence. "Which is," Bronwyn prompted. "Which is that, as far as any physical, tangible, or any other type of evidence goes, we have absolutely nothing. And to be quite honest, I don't think there is any now. So if the only solution left to me is to listen to a voice from the grave..." He paused. Bronwyn waited. "Then that's the solution I have to try." Bronwyn wanted to kiss him. "Do you really think..." "I don't know. But I bloody hope so." Rain was pummeling the roof of the car. The donuts had disappeared, so Mare went to buy more. "Of course, we'd have to be quiet about it. We can't go around telling everyone where the theories are coming from." Bronwyn nodded in agreement. "So what do you think we've got so far then, Bronwyn?" "Mrs. Randall said that she thought there might be something in the diary. That's why I think the sex thing is correct. It was my wording of it, you see. What about the necklace? Or do you think that was your brother?" "No, I don't think that was Ken. I was drawn to a pearl necklace this afternoon. I'm not interested in pearls, but I couldn't stop looking at these. At the time, I could have sworn somebody was behind me, almost looking over my shoulder. I even saw the reflection in the glass. It was a woman, but I didn't see her clearly. But she seemed to have disappeared when I turned around." "The jewellery was never recovered, was it?" "No," replied Mare thoughtfully. "So maybe their whereabouts is significant. Has he still got them, I wonder? Did he keep them as trophies? Something to remember her by?" "That's horrible," said Bronwyn. "Well, maybe he was remorseful about what he had done." He shook his head. "I don't know. You get all sorts. You get people who kill their own spouses because they've had enough of them. Boyfriends killing girlfriends. Schizophrenics escaping from mental institutions and bludgeoning someone to death because they think they're Satan. Bronwyn slowly licked sugar off her fingers. "That's where my husband thinks I belong," she said. "Where?" "A psychiatric unit. I was a resident in one once." Mare sighed. "I'm sorry. When was that?" "About a year and a half ago." "Do you want to tell me about it?" She hesitated. Inna nodded gently. Mark knew I was fragile when he met me. There were no grand illusions of what I was, at least none that I was aware of. I tend to call a spade a spade. Usually what you see is what you get with me. But Mark thought there was something more to be found. Maybe he was right, but I don't know if he's found it yet. I've suffered with depression ever since I was diagnosed at age 14. When I was 14, I took up smoking as well, and at 16 I left home. I went to Dublin, moved into a flat, anything just to be away from my parents. I did a little bit of drugs, nothing too serious. I needed some way of escape. I got a job in a fish and chip shop. It wasn't much, but it paid the rent, kept me alive. She paused. But I hated my life. I hated my parents, but especially my father. You see, when Siobhan died, I went from a happy, confident child to a child that stopped speaking, quite literally. The doctors described me as a voluntary mute. But although I didn't speak, I was constantly thinking things over, getting angrier and angrier. I turned into a bitter, confused, totally depressed version of myself. I first started self-harming when I was 13. She rolled up her left sleeve to reveal a crisscross of angry-looking scars. She stroked them, as if trying to soothe them. I don't think I really understood why I was doing it at the time. The pain was like a release, though. It somehow vented the pain that was inside me, if only for a short period. I hid it from my parents. I didn't want them spoiling something else that I had found to answer for my comfort, if you like. I only stopped self-harming when I began dating Mark. He managed to talk me out of it. And besides, I had found comfort in him. He showed an interest in me. He listened to me, cuddled me, told me I was beautiful. There were tears in her eyes again. When he asked me to marry him, it was like returning to childhood in a way. The happiness I felt, it overwhelmed me. I was suddenly content with who I was again. I forgot about the self-harming, depressive me and became a woman, confident, attractive, married and working. I had quit my job at the fish and chip shop by then and was now working in an office from 9 till 5. And then about 6 months after our honeymoon, the bubble burst. I was finding the workload too stressful. Mark and I barely saw each other due to his long working hours. And it all started to come back. The knowledge of who I was and where I had come from. It's not as if I'd forgotten it. It was more the fact that I seemed to have accepted it. But I hadn't. Not really. I had merely found something to distract me. And then Kieran died. That's when I went off the rails. I started self-harming again. Started drinking. I had stopped smoking briefly, but I took that back up again. She put a piece of donut in her mouth. I stopped eating properly as well. And then a year and a half ago, I had a total breakdown. I just couldn't cope any longer. I was there for 3 months. It was hellish, but it worked. I had horrible nightmares while I was there, about Siobhan, about the murder, about being stuck in that house. They put me through counselling sessions, where they made me talk about all of it. But I knew even then that if I really wanted to lay Siobhan's ghost to rest, I would have to come back to where it all started. Mayer exhaled slowly. He finished his coffee. Jesus, Bronwyn, I'm sorry. I remember you when you were that happy little girl. And I remember you the day Siobhan's body was found. He shook his head. If I had clicked when reading that passage in your diary, maybe things would be a lot different now. I know partly how you feel. I wanted to leave as well. I found village life too slow. Nothing happened. There was nothing to do. I became a constable after my father because I promised him that I'd keep the station running. But in reality, its closure was a foregone conclusion. Raindrops bounced off the forecourt. Bronwyn watched the puddles forming. She thought about Nathan. He was the successful sibling, married with children, manager of a popular restaurant in Cork. Nathan had not been as close to Siobhan as... Lucius, I've just thought of something. What? I hardly dare utter it, she said, looking at him. What are you thinking? A possible perpetrator? Possible, but hopefully not. What's the age of consent? It's 16, isn't it? Mayer nodded. Do you remember what I said during my hypnosis session about Nathan? He said he had just acquired himself a new girlfriend. Oh, wait a minute, said Mayer. Nathan arrived back from school 2 days before Ken's birthday. He always thought himself a bit of a stud, and he always looked and acted older than he was. He could be quite appealing, I'm sure. And Siobhan said she'd done something silly. What if she hadn't sneaked anybody in at all? What if she slept with Nathan? Maybe only once, but still, 15. Mayer's mouth was open. He saw her point. Nathan was working at home that day as well, he said, half to himself. He thought for a moment. Is he there just now? Bronwyn nodded. Okay, let's tread carefully. He may have nothing to do with it. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel again. What if you were to strike up a conversation with him about former girlfriends he used to have before he met his wife? Bronwyn nodded. I could do that, she said quietly. Bronwyn, the chances are you're wrong. But we've got to try. She nodded again. I know. I feel guilty just thinking it, though. Her phone rang. She let it ring without answering. Mark obviously wanted to know where she was. It eventually stopped. Do you want another coffee? She shook her head. I'll never sleep. Not that I'm expecting to do much sleeping tonight anyway. Mark's threatening to take me home tomorrow, back to the unit. Ah, that certainly complicates things a little. Can you talk him out of it? I don't know. He seemed pretty set on it. Chapter 13. They parted, Mayer driving back towards Colston and Bronwyn back towards Cormac. She drove into the village and turned right towards Farndale Falls. As the bridge appeared in her headlights, she felt an overpowering urge to stop. She pulled up just before it and got out. In the light of the headlamps she walked onto the humpback bridge. She could hear the river rushing below her in the darkness, which seemed to drown out any other sound. There were no streetlights on the bridge. The nearest house was several yards away. She was completely on her own. Just as Kieran must have been, walking back from the Giant's pub at 11:45 at night. She leaned against the side of the bridge. The sides were low, easy enough to fall over if you were not completely in control of your body. She jumped as her mobile phone rang again. This time she answered it. Where the hell are you? Snapped Mark. On the bridge. Where? On the bridge, she shouted. What are you doing there? Having some time to myself. Just come on back, Bronwyn. This is stupid. Why don't you come out and you can get me? It's the middle of the night, Bronwyn. I'm not coming out to play any more of your attention-seeking games, and you can go back to Dublin without me. She hung up and strolled back to the car. She got in and shook the rain out of her hair. Then she thumped the steering wheel several times and swore bitterly. 20 minutes later, she saw a flashlight appear over the top of the bridge. She flicked on her headlights. Mark shielded his eyes. He was dressed in a cagoule and had a broad-rimmed hat on. She got out and started walking towards him. You know, I could very happily slap you right now, said Mark. Go ahead. Who knows? You might wake up in the unit. This could all be a bad dream. Then again, it could be real. What do you want? Asked Mark irritably. I want you to take back what you said, she screamed. What I said? Echoed Mark. What, about taking you back to the unit? Yes. Well, I'm not going to, because it's where you belong right now. How can you say that? She yelled. Because I love you, Bronwyn. Oh, really? You've got a funny way of showing it. When you love someone, you need to be able to tell them the truth, even if that truth is hard to hear. You're sick, Bronwyn, and I have a responsibility as your husband to help you get better. They stared at each other through the lashing rain. Bronwyn's fury was evident. I don't know what else to do, he said at last. Bronwyn suddenly turned away from him and stormed off the bridge, heading for the footpath that led onto the moor. Where are you going? He shouted. Bronwyn didn't answer him. "Bronwyn, leave me alone!" she screamed back. Mark followed her through the rain-soaked darkness. He could see her now, in the bouncing torch beam. She was climbing over a stile. "Bronwyn, stop!" Mark went over the stile after her. His cagoule caught on a nail. He heard it rip. At the same time, his foot slipped on the wooden beam, and he fell off the stile, hitting his knee on a rock. Anger and pain surged through him. "Get back here!" he yelled. He picked himself up and ran after her. "You do what I tell you to," he barked. Bronwyn wheeled round. "No, I will not." "Get the hell in the car right now," he demanded. "Don't speak to me like that. I'm your wife. I'm not a sodding mental patient. Well, you're bloody well acting like one. What do you want, Bronwyn?" "I want her back," she screamed, tearing at her jacket. "Don't you understand? She's dead, Bronwyn. She is dead, and there's nothing you or I can do about it. The only thing you can do now is let her go." "How can I do that? I never got to say goodbye, Mark, because dear Daddy wouldn't let us go to the funeral. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. She was just gone. The only adult who really cared for me. Don't you understand? I have to know why. And what's that going to solve, Bronwyn? It's going to give me peace of mind. How is finding out how she was murdered going to bring you peace of mind? Oh, you wouldn't understand," she shouted. She turned away again and plunged deeper onto the black moor. "Where are you?" she screamed into the night. "Can you hear me? Siobhan? Siobhan!" "Jesus," muttered Mark. But he let her go for now. He didn't have the energy to try and stop her. She faded out of sight. He could still hear her, though, calling and calling, demanding the answers he knew she was never going to get. After about 3 minutes, the calling ceased, leaving only the sound of the biting wind and the freezing rain. After another few minutes and no sign of her, he traipsed forward along the sodden path. As he went, he noticed that the torch was starting to lose power. He shook it. "Damn!" Then he called out, "Bronwyn, this torch is going out. Where are you?" As he spoke, the torch waned still further, until it was nothing more than a dim circle at his feet. "Bronwyn!" he shouted again. He turned round to see if the car headlamps were still visible. They were, just. And then he heard movement behind him. He turned round again, saying, "Come on, we need to get back." But Bronwyn wasn't there. He squinted his eyes and peered into the gloom. "Bronwyn?" The same sound he had heard before sounded again, this time over to his left. It did seem like something moving. Probably a deer. But deer don't cry. And that's what Mark heard now. A woman's pitiful whimpers, like she'd had a lover's tiff and was sniffling into her hands. He sighed. "I'm sorry. I am sorry. Why didn't you talk to me about all this? Why did you try and hide it? Do you not trust me?" He laughed quietly then. "Maybe you thought I'd put you in a mental institution." He'd been looking at the ground as he talked. She had stopped sniffling now, obviously listening to what he was saying. "I just wanted you to get better. I wanted to help you. It upsets me to see you like this. If not the unit, then what? A psychiatrist? Because I don't think you can talk to me about this, can you?" He paused. There was no reply. "For God's sake, Bronwyn, say something to me." He heard her begin to cry again. "Come on, I didn't mean to shout at you." Mark heard her come closer. At that point, the torch suddenly seemed to bounce back into life. He turned round to embrace his wife, who had come right up behind him. He could feel her breathing on his neck, feel her hand on his arm. And he still felt these things, as he stared at nothing but the lashing rain. His heart almost stopped beating. He instinctively jumped back away from whatever it was. A sharp, sudden chill thrilled through his body. He ran from the spot, almost tripping over it in haste. But he ran the wrong way, away from the car. He wasn't going to stop through. The icy finger of fear was pushing him forward, away from something. Something he could feel and hear, but not see. And if he couldn't see it, then where was it now? Was it following? That one thought made him run faster than he'd run in a long time. That is until he almost tumbled over Bronwyn. She was on the ground, hugging to her, it seemed, the trunk of a fallen tree that was lying across the pathway. She was soaking wet and shivering violently. "Bronwyn!" He squatted down beside her. "I can't let her go," she whimpered. Mark tried to loosen her grip on the tree, but gently. She wouldn't let go. "I'm not going to take you back," he said. Just come with me now. I'll get you back to the house. You can have a nice hot bath. I'll milk you a warm drink. You'll feel better after that." Bronwyn had started crying again. Mark glanced nervously around him. "I believe you, Bronwyn. I believe you. Just come with me now. Everything's going to be okay." He managed to loosen her grip. "Everything's going to be okay." He helped her back to the car. He put her in, belted her up, and drove back to the house. Once there, he managed to get her up the stairs and escort her to the bathroom. He started running her a bath. "Come on, let's get you out of these wet things." Between them, she undressed and stood shivering on the linoleum floor until the bath was run. She climbed in and lay back, the hot water against her frozen, goosebump-covered skin. It seemed even hotter than it was, but it felt wonderful. She closed her eyes. Mark knelt down beside the tub. He stroked her hair. 5 minutes passed in calm. The tap dripped, and they could hear faintly the howling elements. "That's starting to feel better, isn't it?" She nodded gently, still keeping her eyes closed. After a few more minutes of silence, she reopened them. "Why did you really marry me, Mark?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I told you why. You told me what I wanted to hear." She looked at him. "There were no hidden gems, Mark. It was just me. The girl who hated herself. The girl who cut her arms, did drugs. Why were you attracted to that?" Mark ran more hot water into the bath. He still didn't answer. He scratched his chin. "Like attracts like," he said. He met her eyes. "When I was 15, I almost hanged myself." She stared at him. "You what?" "Oh my God, Mark. What?" "I used my father's elastic braces. They dug into my neck. The paramedics had to cut them off. So I'm told." "The scar," she said. Mark nodded. "You always said that was an accident." "I know." He paused. "I was unhappy at school. I couldn't fit in. Couldn't get a girlfriend, couldn't communicate properly with my peers. Girls thought I was stupid. They didn't want to be seen with me, let alone know me. I was in a psychiatric unit for 6 months after my suicide attempt. It pretty much transformed me. I finished my schooling somewhere else, made a lot of friends, felt better about myself. Girls started to become interested in me, but I wasn't interested in them. And then one day I walked into a fish and chip shop, and the girl who served me was very cute. She had lovely curls, beautiful eyes, a little diamond stud in her nose. All of those things were nice, but they didn't stand out. And then at one point you rolled up your sleeve to keep the cuff out of the grease, and I saw your scars. And they did stand out." Tears had returned to Bronwyn's eyes. She raised a hand out of the water and tickled the end of his nose affectionately. He smiled. "I realized that's what I was looking for. Somebody else with problems. I wanted to help you. I wanted to make you happy. I wanted someone I could share things with. But it was too difficult to discuss it. It was easier to play the role of the unscathed. I wanted to find out why you..." He smiled sadly. "I don't know. As I said, like attracts like." She ran her wet hand through his hair. "I love you," she said, her chin quivering. She cried. "I love you so much." She leaned forward and put her arms around him. She kissed him passionately. He pulled off his shirt. He removed his wet jeans. He climbed into the bath with her. Under the slates of an old roof, in a large cast-iron tub, they made love. Skin against skin, scars against scars. It was approaching 2 a.m. by the time they made it back to the bedroom. Far off they could hear thunder rumbling over the Atlantic. "Is that rain ever going to stop?" asked Bronwyn. Mark smiled. "Don't be so glum," he said. They whispered sweet nothings to each other for the next 20 minutes, Bronwyn occasionally giggling at what he was saying. The thunder suddenly rumbled overhead. "Go and close the curtains," said Mark. She kissed him and crossed to the window. A flicker of lightning lit up the rooftop, and in that flicker Bronwyn saw something. She saw the figure standing in the alcove window, looking straight at her. It was a woman with straight brown hair. Bronwyn let out one gasp. The lightning vanished, and blackness obscured her vision. Chapter 14. Bronwyn opened her eyes, taking a deep breath in as she did so. "What happened?" asked Mark. She gazed up at him. "I saw her," she gasped. "I saw her in the window." Mark nodded. "It's okay. I didn't imagine it. I know." She sat up and tried to get to her feet. Mark helped her. She stared out the window for a moment, then went to the alcove room, taking Mark with her. It was freezing. Bronwyn saw her breath in front of her. "It's so cold," she said. She was only in her nightdress. "Let's not stay," said Mark. "She was here, not half a minute ago. Can you feel her?" "I feel uncomfortable, Bronwyn." Bronwyn smiled. It was a strange smile. "I don't." She let out a little laugh. She moved to the alcove window and looked out, wrapping her arms around her. She stood very still, gazing through the dark pane. All at once, her arms slid to her sides. She began to sway very gently from side to side, as if rocking herself for comfort. She started to hum. "Bronwyn?" She didn't answer, but kept on humming and swaying. "Bronwyn," said Mark again. Still she did not answer. He frowned. "Are you okay?" The girl giggled and shrugged, still keeping her back to him. "Who are you?" asked Mark in a low voice. No reply. "Answer me," he said sternly. At that she stopped swaying. The humming ceased. "I knew it was you," she said suddenly. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Who am I?" She seemed not to have heard the question. "I'm too tired tonight." "Too tired for what?" asked Mark. She turned towards him. "You don't have to be like that. You know I want to." "Who are you talking to?" The girl continued. "Please, I—" She stopped again, as if interrupted. She was looking at somebody, but it wasn't him. She looked at the floor, then slowly, as if reluctantly, she began to remove her nightdress. "Bronwyn!" Bronwyn's head snapped up. "What?" she said. The next morning Bronwyn was again on the swing bench in the garden, but today it was just the cigarettes, not the coffee. She stared dejectedly towards where the hills usually were, but this morning they were invisible through the haar. It was 10 to 10 by her watch, when Seamus appeared with a small stepladder and large wicker basket. He placed both under the plum tree. "I made scrambled eggs this earlier, with bacon and field mushrooms. Jolly nice it was too." Bronwyn ignored him. "It's a fine crop this year," he said. "Yes, Dad," replied Bronwyn. "How many is that you've had already?" he asked. "Just leave it alone, Dad, all right? Leave it alone." He started picking. "Why don't you come and give me a hand? I'm having my breakfast." He placed a plum into the basket. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. He was on the second rung, calmly detaching the fruit from their umbilical cords. Bronwyn threw her butt in the grass, rose and sauntered over towards him, her hands in her pockets. She leaned against the tree. "Why didn't you let us go to the funeral?" He looked at her. "What funeral?" "Siobhan's." He kept picking. "I thought it would be too distressing for you children." "It was distressing not to go, Dad. She was our nanny for 5 years. Bronwyn, I had to make a decision at the time. Now, maybe it was the wrong one, but I had your best interest at heart, I promise you." She looked at him coldly. "So you went on your own, leaving Mum to look after us?" Nursing a black eye. He stopped picking. "Black eye," he said, frowning. "Yeah, Dad, she had a black eye. She quite often had injuries like that. She must have been awfully clumsy. I never hurt your mother, Bronwyn. You hear me? I loved her." Bronwyn said nothing. "I never raised a hand to her. Don't you dare speak to me like that again." He ripped a plum off its branch and threw it into the basket. Bronwyn picked one now herself. "Sorry, Dad," she said coolly, handling the fruit. I didn't mean to upset you." As she went back inside, Nathan appeared from the yard, driving a Land Rover. "Where are you off to?" she asked. "A bit of dry stone diking on the moor. You want to come?" She was about to say no, then in a second changed her mind. "Sure. Let me get my coat." They drove slowly along the track. "So what are we doing exactly? Building another Hadrian's Wall?" Nathan laughed. "Not quite. Just a bit of repair work." "Since when did you know how to repair stone dikes?" she asked. "Dad taught me." "Did he now?" They drove for about 15 minutes before Bronwyn spotted the tumble-down wall. "There's our patient," said Nathan. A large section of dike had collapsed, leaving a huge gap. They set to work. Bronwyn learned from her brother, and she soon got the hang of it. They had been building steadily for 20 minutes when Bronwyn asked, "So what was your love life like before Miriam came on the scene?" "Why do you ask?" "Curiosity. I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours." Nathan grinned. "There's not much to tell, really. I only wish there was." "Nonsense. I'm sure a stud like you had lots of girlfriends." He chuckled. "Well, there were a few. My first was in school. In fact, most of them were in school. Jenny Beechcroft. She was the first. I kissed her in the washrooms. She was all right, I suppose. It was more experimental than anything else. Anyway, I think she ended up with Timothy Howard, if I remember correctly. I have no idea what came of that." He slotted a stone into place. "Then there was Mary Bell. She was gorgeous. 13 I was then. We used to sit and make funny faces at each other in chapel." Bronwyn laughed. Nathan went on. "At 14 there was Iris McPhee, a fiery redhead. At 15... Who did I have at 15? Bronwyn wasn't positioning stones anymore. He suddenly laughed slightly to himself, as if remembering something. 16. Alice Norton." Bronwyn watched her brother's face. He had skipped 15 deliberately. But why? What didn't he want to tell? She decided not to press him. But she knew there had been somebody. He went on to tell of numerous other girlfriends before he met Miriam. Bronwyn hardly listened. She had hot prickles all over her skin now, and had stopped concentrating on what she was doing. Chapter 15. Kieran was playing with Siobhan's necklace. He was seated on her lap, examining the pearl beads one at a time. While he was doing this, she was busy explaining to him where pearls came from. Bronwyn was sitting on the floor in front of the fire, puzzling over a jigsaw, and Ken was staring out the window in a daze, wondering what he was going to get for his birthday. The door was suddenly burst open, and in walked Nathan, hair slicked back, wearing casuals and grinning from ear to ear. "Hi, guys. Did you miss me?" Bronwyn leapt up and ran to him. She hugged her brother around the chest. "I missed you. Nobody else did." "Thanks, Bron." Siobhan laughed. "Hi, Nathan. Are you back for holidays?" "I wish. Study leave, that's all." "Are you coming for my birthday meal?" asked Ken. "I wouldn't miss it for a world." Kieran was still sitting on Siobhan's lap. He'd only glanced round when his brother had come in, before going back to his examinations. He now took hold of her finger and looked at the ring. "Are you planning on being a jeweller when you're older, Kieran?" asked Nathan. Siobhan nodded, smiling. "What's a jeweller?" asked Kieran. "Someone who sells rings," said Nathan. He stretched. "I'm going for a bath. I'll see you guys later." Nathan ate downstairs that evening with his parents, while the rest of them ate in the nursery with Siobhan. "Why does he get to eat in the dining room and we don't?" asked Bronwyn, grumbling. Siobhan sighed. "Because he's older, sweetheart, that's all. It's a privilege. When you're his age, you'll be able to do that too. Anyway, you've got me." She grinned stupidly, and Bronwyn laughed. "You're funny," she said. "I know," replied Siobhan in a silly voice. Later, while Siobhan was tucking her in, Nathan popped his head round the door. "Good night, Bron. Sleep tight." He turned to Siobhan. "Do you fancy a game of Scrabble?" "Yeah, why not? I'll be through in a minute." As Bronwyn lay there in her bed, she could hear Nathan and Siobhan laughing until what seemed to her late in the night. Eventually, she fell asleep. When she woke, it was still dark. She was aware of the sound of an owl hooting somewhere outside, and then she was aware of another sound, Ken snoring next door. Bronwyn grinned. After a few minutes of listening to him, she climbed out of bed and snuck out into the corridor. She tiptoed to his door and listened. Then she moved on towards Kieran's room. He was snoring too. She had to suppress a snigger. I wonder if Siobhan snores, she thought. She made her way to Siobhan's room and quietly put her ear up to the door. At first there was only silence, apart from the gentle creaking of her bed. And then she heard her. But it was different to the sounds coming from her brother's rooms. It sounded like she was ill. Bronwyn frowned. She was moaning. Did she have a sore tummy? Maybe it was the pork chops they'd had for supper. As she listened, her discomfort seemed to increase because the moans became louder. She was on the point of going in to see if Siobhan was okay, but then changed her mind and went back to her own room. The next morning, Siobhan seemed fine. When she picked them up from Saturday school at lunchtime, Nathan was in the car. "Do you want to go and get some sweets, guys?" asked Siobhan. It was a silly question. "I thought you were meant to be studying, Nathan," asked Bronwyn. "I have been. I'm just tagging along." They drove to the sweet shop in Colston and chose their favourites. When it came to paying for them, Nathan insisted. "Are you sure?" asked Siobhan. "Of course I'm sure. Put that money away." Siobhan smiled and closed her wallet. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." He winked at her. As they were leaving, Bronwyn said, "She's too old for you. Grow up, Bron," he told her. They went to the park. Siobhan pushed Bronwyn on the swing, while Nathan went down the slide with Ken. They played for half an hour, eating their sweets. When they got back to the house, it was homework time, for Nathan too. That evening, Bronwyn was thinking about birthdays. "Why do we celebrate the day we were born?" she asked Siobhan. "Why not? It's a big occasion when any child is born. Parents always want to celebrate it. They remember it like yesterday, every little detail." "How did the babies get into the tummy?" she asked. Siobhan paused. "Magic," she said, after a moment. "I don't believe that," replied Bronwyn. Siobhan smiled. "Well, it happens with the help of the man. The man is very important. You see, the baby grows from a seed, which the man provides." "How?" asked Bronwyn. She thought a moment longer. "He inserts it." "Would you like to have babies?" asked Bronwyn. "I would love to. More than anything else." "Is that why you look after us? Because you love children so much?" "Something like that. I've always liked children. I enjoy being around them." Bronwyn was awoken the next morning by Ken jumping on her bed. "Wake up! It's my birthday!" She laughed. "Where's my present?" "Here's your present," she said, and gave him a big sloppy kiss. He grimaced and wiped his cheek. "Ugh!" he exclaimed. They had breakfast in the dining room that morning, Ken sitting next to his parents at the top of the end of the table. His mother was cooing over him, rather more than Seamus would have liked. Siobhan came late to the table. She took her seat quietly. Margaret was still fussing over her birthday boy. "Have you got everything you want to eat?" He nodded, his mouth full of sausage. "Do you like having breakfast in here?" He finished his mouthful. "I was looking forward to it." "We should do it more often." "Margaret," said Seamus abruptly. "I just think it would be nice for them." Seamus glared at her. "You know my rules." He picked up his coffee cup. "I'll say no more on the matter." Margaret turned her attention back to her son. "Maybe we'll do it next month. Have all you children down here with us." She stroked Ken's hair. "I love you." "Margaret, go to the kitchen," said Seamus. "What for?" she asked. "To get more bacon," he said, almost smiling at her. He indicated to Ken's plate. "He's running out." Margaret stood up to go to the kitchen. Seamus followed. As soon as the door was closed behind them, Seamus clasped his hand over his wife's mouth so that she couldn't scream, and with his other took a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back. Then he whispered in her ear, "Do not undermine me, bitch. I will have my way." Her eyes were wide with terror. "I thought we were past these little warnings. And mark my words, woman, this is just a warning. If you cross me again, I will not be responsible for the consequences. Do you hear me?" He gave her hair one sharp tug and released her. She was trembling. Her hair was dishevelled, her breathing stifled. "Sort yourself out before you go back through. I wouldn't want you upsetting the children." A few minutes later, Margaret re-emerged from the kitchen, carrying a hot tray of bacon. None of the children noticed anything different about her, because she had managed to compose herself well enough. Her marriage was an illusion. She had to keep up appearances. She put more bacon on Ken's plate, and then took the tray around the others. She was careful to tend to same as first. Siobhan declined any more food, but she had hardly eaten anything to start with. She looked pale this morning. "Are you all right?" asked Margaret. "I'm not feeling too well, that's all." After breakfast, Siobhan drove them back into Colston. They were going to go and see a film at the cinema. I need to pop into the chemist first, so if I leave you with Nathan, I'll meet you by the popcorn machine, okay?" The chemist was just across the road from the cinema. When she returned, Bronwyn handed her a box of popcorn. "We've just had breakfast," said Siobhan. "This is second breakfast," replied Bronwyn. Siobhan accepted the gift. Second breakfast. Okay. They went into the auditorium and took seats near the door. It was a tame western they were watching. Halfway through the film, Siobhan slipped out. She seemed to be away for a long time, and when she returned, was quizzed by Nathan. "I'm not very well," she whispered. "Would you mind if I just skip the rest of the film? I need to get some fresh air." "Go ahead." When the others came out of the cinema, Siobhan was waiting for them, but she looked as if she would keel over at any minute. Unlike Margaret, she was not good at hiding her feelings from the children. She had never had to do it before now. On her way back to Cormac, she could hardly drive the car. Her hands trembled on the wheel. "Take it easy," said Nathan. "You're fine." "Oh, really? And would you know that?" He stared at her in silent surprise. "I'm sorry." A second or two later, she said, "I'm not fine, Nathan. I'm far from fine." Her chin quivered. She took a deep breath and fought back tears. She looked at him, and then at the kids in the back, through the mirror. She seemed to stare at them longest, before dragging her eyes back to the road. Chapter 16. The last stone went into place for now. There was still a sizable gap, but Ronman's back was aching, her hands hurt and her stomach rumbled. Nathan had brought lunch, which they now shared, sitting against the wall which sheltered them from the wind that blew from the other side. Ronman chewed thoughtfully on her sandwich. "You never told me about the girlfriend you had when you were 15. That one wasn't important. The others were. Why wasn't she?" He didn't answer. She pushed him. "Look, I made a mistake with her, okay? I did things stupid. Something I'm not proud of. Just drop it, would you? Ask me something else." You didn't force it to... Bronwyn, what the hell did you take me for?" A crow was standing on the grass, watching Bronwyn eat. She threw the last bit of crust to it, and it flew off with a piece in its beak. They finished the wall in another hour, but they did so in relative silence. Nathan finally stretched. "Excuse me a moment," he said. He hopped over the wall and sauntered a few paces before stopping to have a pee. He closed his eyes. His bladder was bursting. When he'd finished, he opened his eyes again, zipped up, and was about to turn to leave when he spotted something lying on a clump of moss a couple of feet away. It was a small rectangle of card, black, with an image on it. The image was nondescript from where he was standing. Out of sheer curiosity, he moved forward to have a closer look. "Ronman," he called. "What?" He beckoned her with his finger. She carefully climbed over the wall and came to join him. He pointed. Bronwyn looked down at the elusive Cluedo card, the one that had gone missing from the wallet. Nathan scratched his head in bewilderment. Bronwyn just stared. "You didn't put that there, did you?" He looked at her. "You're full of strange questions today, aren't you?" "Sorry." "Why would that be here?" "Bronwyn, I don't know, do I?" He picked it up. "Oh well, here it is. Ken will be pleased." They started back to the Land Rover. "There's a lot of weird things happening at the moment," said Bronwyn as she got in. "Like what?" Nathan turned the key in the ignition. The engine made a funny noise, and then died. Okay, that's not good." He tried again. The same thing happened. "Sounds like the battery's dead," said Bronwyn. "Damn!" said Nathan. He tried several more times to get the engine running, but no luck. He pulled out his phone. "Dad, the Land Rover battery's flat. We're going to need a rescue." They sat in relative warmth for 15 minutes before Seamus turned up in another Land Rover. He had brought a thick piece of tow rope, which he attached to the front bumper. "I'll give her a look over when we're back," he said. When they returned to the house, Bronwyn wanted to show Ken the Cluedo card, but he wasn't around. "He went out for a walk about half an hour ago," said Seamus. Bronwyn put on a thick jacket and headed out along the road towards the village. What was the Cluedo card doing out on the moor? It was the oddest and most unusual place for it to be. She didn't know what to make of it, but she had a feeling that it was in some way significant. What was even more significant, however, was Nathan's own admittance that the girl he had been with, aged 15, had been someone he had made a mistake with. Had he seen with Siobhan? Had he been with Siobhan all those years ago? And had he silenced her through fear of being found out? And what about the jewels? Did he have them hidden away somewhere? "Where are you trying to tell me about the necklace, Siobhan? What are you trying to tell me about the necklace, Siobhan?" she whispered. "Does your killer still have it? Where has he put it?" These were things she needed to discuss with Mare. As she was walking, she caught sight of a figure bent double in the field to her right. She stopped. "That wouldn't be Mr. Elliot, would it?" she called. The figure straightened up. The old man squinted at her. "Good grief, Bronwyn Doyle. I don't believe I've seen you since you were about 15. How are you?" She shrugged. "I've been better. Still picking field mushrooms, I see. And I'll continue to pick them until I can't bend down any more." She laughed. "I was sorry to hear about your mother. She was a fine woman." Bronwyn smiled faintly. "Thank you." "I've seen your brother Nathan a few times. He's looking well." "He is. At least your mother had one child with her when she died." "What do you mean?" "Nathan." Bronwyn frowned. "I didn't know that," she said quietly. Yes, he happened to be staying over when Margaret passed." Bronwyn stared at the mushrooms in his hand. "Nathan was there when Mum died. He was there when Siobhan died." My God, she thought. Could he have been there when Kieran fell off that bridge? Mrs. Randalls had said there was more to the last two deaths than met the eye. Mare said they all occurred on the same dates. Were these deaths both murder? If so, then the killer was most likely the same. Is that it, Siobhan? A shiver suddenly passed through her entire body. Her heart started to pound. "That's it," said Bronwyn with a sudden conviction. "And you've been trying to warn people. You were trying to warn them of the events to come. Because the person who killed my mother and my brother was the same person who killed you." Lucia's mare met her in the Giant's pub half an hour later. "You were right," said Bronwyn, as they sat down with drinks. "It's not just a coincidence. All three deaths are linked. I don't know why, I just know it. That's why Mrs. Randalls heard her screaming before each death. It was a warning, Lucius." Mare thought for a moment. "Your brother wasn't here that night, drinking heavily." He glanced around at the barman. He drummed his fingers. "I wonder," he said. He stood up. "Excuse me." He approached the bar and spoke to the man for a minute or two, then returned to the table. "He knows what I'm talking about. He wasn't working that night, but his colleague was. It's her day off today." "Where does she live?" "Fisherman's Drive." "That's just up from the pier," said Bronwyn. A rather fleshy-looking girl appeared in the doorway of the last house on Fisherman's Drive. Her hair was dyed black, and her stomach protruded from under her t-shirt, with what looked like a semi-precious stone emerging from the belly button. "Yes," she said. Mare showed her his badge. "What's wrong?" she asked, a little alarmed. "Oh, nothing's wrong," said Mare reassuringly. "I just wanted to pick your brains about something, that was all. It's a bit chilly out here. Can we come in?" "Who's she?" "She is helping with my inquiries." The girl grudgingly showed them through to a rather shabby-looking kitchen area. "What do you want?" she asked. I was wondering if you might remember that case 3 years ago, roughly around this time too, of the young man who drowned at Farndale Falls." She nodded. "What about him?" "He was drinking in the pub that night, wasn't he?" Look, I threw him out, okay? He was wasted. I wasn't going to serve him any more alcohol. I knew this was going to come back and bite me. She folded her arms suddenly. I'm not here to question you about how much alcohol he had that night. She suddenly clicked her fingers at him. Now I remember you. You grilled me for an hour and a half, and I'll tell you exactly what I told you then. I served him 5 drinks, and that was it. You seem to remember quite well. I've got a good memory, okay? Is that allowed? What's your name again? Katie. Well, Katie, I'm not blaming you for his death, so you don't need to get all defensive. All I want to know is, do you remember anything specific about him at the time? Oh, what you mean other than him being completely drunk and a pain in the arse? Bronwyn bristled. Mayor sighed patiently. Yes, Katie. Other than that. She paused for a moment. I think he was upset about something. 3 years earlier. Kieran strolled into the Giant's pub, bringing with him a cold blast of air. He marched up to the bar. Guinness. Katie picked up a glass and stuck it under the tap. Anything else for you, sir? Double whiskey. She filled up the whiskey glass with a double shot and placed it on the bar top. Even from where she was standing, she still caught the scent of alcohol. It seeped from his pores like sweat. He paid the tariff and found a table in the corner. Katie then watched as he proceeded to drain the double whiskey, before immediately picking up his pint and beginning to drink it down like it was water. Katie's jaw dropped. He had a problem. After several huge gulps, he replaced the glass on the table and sat hunched over it, breathing heavily. She pretended to be busy, but all the time she kept half an eye on him. The rest of the Guinness disappeared fairly rapidly. For the next 15 minutes he sat, obviously brooding over something. Eventually he came back to the bar. Same again. Do you know what the word, what is that now? Please, I think? Excuse me? Just give me the sodding drinks, would you? Some barmaid you are. He slammed the money down on the counter and grabbed his whiskey. Bring me the Guinness when you're ready, please. He sat down again. This time he sipped at his double shot. She brought him the Guinness a few minutes later. You don't need to be rude, she said. Go away, said Kieran. She rolled her eyes and left him alone. The drunker he got, the more sombre he became, but at times it looked like he was arguing with some imaginary person. The other thing he noticed was that he kept glancing at his watch, as if he was waiting for somebody, perhaps the person he was arguing with in his head. At 10:30 he staggered to the bar and tried to order another drink. Katie put her foot down. You're drunk. I can't serve you anymore. Kieran slammed his fist down on the bar top. Just give me a fucking drink! Right, that's it. Get out! The door banged shut. Mayer scribbled in his notebook. So you think he was waiting for somebody who didn't turn up? Katie shrugged. Possibly. He finished writing and closed his book. Thank you. Is that all? That's all, replied Mayer. So, he said, as they were walking down the street. Agitated, angry, there to meet someone who didn't turn up. Bronwyn walked in silence. But maybe this person did turn up, just not in the pub. Mayer stood on the humpback bridge and peered down into the water. He looked at the swirling current and then at the raging torrent that tumbled down over the rocks. He turned to Bronwyn. If I was having an argument with somebody here, I mean, a heated argument with raised voices, do you think the people in that house over there would hear? That's what I asked myself. I don't think they would. There's too much noise from the waterfall, and it's dark, no lights here. But surely you spoke to the local residents 3 years ago. Yes, but back then there was no suspicion of foul play, so the questions posed may have been the wrong ones. He paused. Let's test it. Go as far as that house. I'll call out, and we'll see how well we can hear each other. Bronwyn followed his directions. He started shouting something at her. She hardly heard a word of it. She could hear him, but faintly. Had she been inside the house, she would have not heard anything. She walked back to the bridge. Well? If I were in that house, I wouldn't have heard you. He didn't really have a chance, did he? Probably not much. And his killer knew that. It wouldn't be difficult to tip a drunk man over the edge of that bridge. There would be no witnesses. Bronwyn shook her head. Why? She asked. Because he'd found out who killed Siobhan. He wanted to confront him. He waits for him in the pub, but he doesn't show. So he leaves. Then he bumps into him, here. But it's no coincidence. The killer knows he's been found out. He needs to silence your brother. And where better to do it than on a dark bridge, where you can make it look like an accident. Bronwyn nodded sadly. Nathan was here when my mother died, Lucius. He was here when Siobhan died. What are the chances he was the person on this bridge that night? Did you ask him about girlfriends? She nodded. And? He told me about all of them, except the one he had when he was 15. Apparently he made a mistake with her, and he wasn't proud about it. Lucius stood perfectly still. He was present at both of the murders, you say? She nodded. Then you need to find out whether he was here that night. Chapter 17. They made their way back into the village. The coroner said she died from an overdose of sleeping tablets, said Bronwyn. Mused Mayor. So another death that looks like a simple accident. Why? So as not to arouse suspicion, of course. Exactly. But that leaves us with only two suspects. Nathan and your father. Bronwyn stopped walking. She stared at him. I beg your pardon? My father may be a nasty piece of work, detective, but he is not capable of killing 3 people, especially not his own son. Mary nodded. I'm sorry. He paused. But it still doesn't mean he didn't do it. Oh, come on, Lucius. You don't really believe that. I'm open to anything at the moment, Bronwyn, but the fact is, we're narrowing things down here. And if your nanny's ghost is correct about the killer being the same, then those are our 2 main suspects. But we still haven't got a shred of proof. What we need is a confession. Bronwyn returned to the house. There was a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had wanted the truth. Now she wasn't so sure. What if the truth uncovered something she didn't want to know? It certainly seemed to be heading in that direction. Wolfgang greeted her at the front door, a little whiskered, friendly face, an innocent face, in amongst all this guilt and suspicion. She wanted to be somewhere quiet. She headed for her father's library on the ground floor. The door was already open. She slowed up. Nathan was perusing one of the shelves. He had his back to her. He really was the last person she wanted to speak to at the moment. She was about to slip away when he turned. Hi, he said. You okay? She smiled. I'm fine. He nodded. Where did you go? Just for a walk. Did you find Ken? No. He went back to his perusing. Does Dad have a copy of Twelfth Night, do you know? I don't know. Miriam's doing it for her next play. Do you go to the theatre with Mark? Bronwyn shook his head. No time, she said. She paused. I understand you were here when Mum died. He turned. Yes, I was. I'm sorry. That must have been hard. Nathan just looked at her. What happened? Nathan shrugged. I took her up some tea in the morning and couldn't wake her. I checked her pulse. And... Bronwyn looked at the floor. I know it sounds like a cliché, but she just looked like she was sleeping. I called an ambulance, but it was too late by that time. Bronwyn caught the tear that was trickling down her right cheek. If Dad had been there... Bronwyn looked up. Dad was away? Nathan nodded. Yeah, he went to a conference the afternoon before. I called him as soon as it happened. Nathan spread his arms. We laid her out in here, the night before the funeral. Dad's idea. We had candles. He was so respectful of her. She was dressed in her Sunday best. The funeral home did a wonderful job on her. She was beautiful. Several people from the village came to pay their respects and leave flowers. Bronwyn felt her cheeks flushing with anger. How could he show her off in that way? It wasn't like that, Bron. Oh, of course it was. Come and look at my dead wife. Mine. I owned her. Quite a specimen, she was too. Good at all things domestic. Easily kept in line. Just give her a slap and she'll do as she's told. Bronwyn. Oh, don't tell me you didn't notice her bruises, the black eyes. Don't talk like that. Dad always likes to be in control. And if he doesn't get his way, he'll snap. Stop it, shouted Nathan. No, you've got to hear this. You've got to hear the truth. It's not the truth. Dad loved her. And he loved all of us, too. He was just strict. So he liked the things done a certain way. It's not a crime. Domestic abuse is, replied Bronwyn. You know what I think the truth is, Bronwyn? I think this is all just resentment, because he didn't tuck you into bed at night, because he didn't hug you enough. Enough! Shrieked Bronwyn. He didn't hug me at all. And with that she turned to leave. At the door she stopped and said, I thought you weren't on his side. Maybe I just feel sorry for him, Bronwyn. I mean, after all, he's hated by you, hated by Ken. He's lost a son, and now he's lost his wife. Who's left to feel for him except me? It was 5:30. Ken wasn't back from his walk. She decided she would take the car and go and look for him. She drove into the village, taking her car along the back streets. She checked the Giant's pub, but he wasn't there. She was growing worried. She parked her car down at the pier and got out to think and breathe in the sea air. She looked up towards Cormac Hill. She saw a figure up there, near the edge of the cliff. She knew it was Ken. She started walking fast now, onto the footpath that took walkers the short climb up to the viewpoint at the top. By the time she reached the summit, she was slightly out of breath. Ken had his back to her. She could see he had a bottle in his right hand. He took a swig now, and took a sudden step frighteningly close to the edge. Ken! She shouted. He turned abruptly. He stared at her, oddly, almost as if he didn't recognize her. What are you doing up here? She asked. Drinking? She started walking towards him. Just stay away. What? Stop right there. I'm not backing down. I'm just plucking up the courage. The courage for what? Asked Bronwyn uneasily. Ken dangled his foot out over the cliff and then laughed. No, Ken. Don't even think like that. The smile faded from her brother's face. Why? He took another swig. Because I've already lost one brother, and I'm damned if I'm going to lose on you. You don't need me. Nobody needs me. His face curled into a bitter knot. You know, all I want is for somebody to love me. I love you, said Bronwyn. I always have. You're my little brother. And what about Anna? Does she love me? No, she doesn't. And why would she? I'm a car mechanic. I've got a drink problem. I'm depressed. I'm my own worst enemy, aren't I? He suddenly turned and stepped right to the edge of the cliff. Ken! There's nothing here for me, Bron. I miss Kieran. I hate my life. I hate my past. I've had enough. Don't, begged Bronwyn, tears welling up in her eyes. I came back to you, remember. What do you think I'm going through? What are you going through, Bron? Is it worse than me? I really struggled to come back here, Ken. This has affected me as much as you. She rolled her up her sleeves. Look, Ken. You want proof? Look at the cuts. Ken didn't look. You think I haven't felt what you felt? You think I haven't wanted love too? We didn't get it from our parents. We got it from our nanny. And when she died, that was the end of it. She paused. I know what Kieran meant to you. I know he loved you. Shut up, Bron. Just shut up. I can't do it anymore. He shifted his feet and spread his arms wide. Oh, Christ! Screamed Bronwyn. He'll catch me, Bron. Kieran will catch me. Then it'll all be fine. Don't you dare, Ken, she yelled, the veins in her neck swelling as she shouted. I love you too, Ken, she screamed, flapping her arms in despair. I love you too. She collapsed to her knees in floods of tears. Oh, God, Ken, don't do this to me, she sobbed. I need you. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Ken helped her up. She flung her arms around him and squeezed him hard. She didn't want to let him go. They were together. They hate each other. And she didn't want anything else. Eventually she pulled back and wiped her eyes. Then she took the bottle off him and took a large swig. You've got expensive taste for an alcoholic, she said. I know. She thumped him playfully. She stroked his face and gazed at him lovingly. I'll stop smoking, if you stop drinking. I'll try. She smiled and kissed him. They sat down on a bench and looked out towards the vast Atlantic. They had their arms around each other now. Remember Siobhan used to bring us up here, said Bronwyn. Remember we used to listen to the roar of the waves and pretend it was the giant breathing. Ken smiled and nodded. The sun was beginning to set. It's going to be okay, Ken, she whispered. She kissed his cheek and laid her head on his shoulder. Do you remember, too, what Siobhan's favourite hymn was? Hosanna. Bronwyn now began to sing softly. Give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning. Give me oil in my lamp, I pray. Give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning. Keep me burning till the break of day. Chapter 18. Seamus was in his study when the phone on his desk rang. Seamus Doyle? Mr. Doyle, said a woman's voice. It's Mrs. Bailey, Siobhan's mother. Good grief, said Seamus. How long has it been? Too long. Listen, I just wanted to send my condolences. I read about your wife's death in the obituaries. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I appreciate that. How are you doing yourself? Oh, we're okay. It was Siobhan's birthday recently, so you can imagine that it was quite difficult. I'm sure. The study door was now opened and Bronwyn stuck her head in. She made to leave when she saw he was on the phone, but he beckoned her in. Hold on. Would you like to speak to my daughter? Oh, I would love to. Is she there? She's just come in. He lowered the receiver. Bronwyn, it's Mrs. Bailey. She'd like a word. When her father had left the room, Bronwyn put the phone to her ear. Mrs. Bailey. Bronwyn, how are you? Fine, she lied. A little shell-shocked, I suppose, but apart from that. It's really good to hear from you. My other daughter, Claire, has just had a baby, a little boy. Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I'm so pleased. If she's anything like Siobhan, she'll be a fabulous mother. I know. She paused. Poor girl. I know she always wanted children for her own. Siobhan couldn't have them. That's why she was a nanny. All she wanted was children. I'm not following, Mrs. Bailey, I'm sorry. Siobhan was barren. She couldn't have children. Bronwyn met her father in the hallway. I wanted to ask you what time supper was. About 8:15. She headed upstairs after that and flopped into bed. She set her alarm for 6:45 and went to sleep. Her dream was very peculiar and very vivid. She had the sensation of being very warm and snug. She seemed to be floating in water. All around her was a red haze. She felt like a baby in a womb. There was a feeling of safety. All at once the water began to drain away. The womb around her began to shrivel and die, and she couldn't breathe. She tried to get her breath, but she couldn't. It was as if all the air had been sucked out. She knew she was dying. And then, all of a sudden, she was no longer in the womb, but on the moor. She was standing on the track. In the mud ahead of her were tiny footprints, a baby's footprints, leading off into the distance. She heard a voice now, Siobhan's voice. Follow the footprints, she said. Follow my clues. Suddenly it was as if she were viewing a flashback from the past. She saw them all playing board games together, Siobhan and the children. Then something soft and firm began to land on her head, and she found herself standing in the garden beneath a plum tree. Plums were falling on her. Now she saw an image. It looked like a cartwheel with different coloured sections. She saw a coffin floating in a pond, and all at once she seemed to be wading into it. The water seemed thick, difficult to move through, until she realised she was in fact wading through a sea of mother-of-pearl. Bronwyn opened her eyes. She lay there for 5 minutes, not moving, just thinking hard. At 7:30 she walked into the living room. Quietly she went over and sat down beside Mark on the sofa. She accepted a drink from her father, politely thanking him. Nathan was reading the kidnap book he discovered, and Ken was sitting by himself on the other side of the room, keeping himself to himself. He was sitting next to a small glass and mahogany cabinet which displayed an old tea set. Bronwyn now rose and made her way over there. She pretended to examine the china. As she did, she put her hand out to her side and wiggled her fingers slowly. Ken took them gently in his own. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you," he replied. She sat next to him at dinner. She was relieved they were going home tomorrow. It had been an emotional weekend, to say the least. Seamus had made a huge steak pie for them all, which everyone enjoyed, even Bronwyn. When pudding arrived, it was an enormous plum tart. "You've been busy, Dad," said Nathan. "This looks fantastic, thank you." "Well, I just wanted to show my appreciation for you all being here this weekend, and I hope you can move on from here in harmony. Margaret would have wanted that." "Well said, Dad," said Nathan. He looked at his sister. Seamus sliced up the tart while Nathan served. They dug in eagerly, Bronwyn not quite as fast. "Mr. Plum," joked Nathan, and they all laughed. Everybody, that is, except Bronwyn, whose spoon was now frozen in her mouth. Very subtly, her arm began to tremble, as if she'd just had an emotional shock. She removed the spoon from her mouth and put it back in the bowl. Siobhan's voice echoed in her ears. Bronwyn excused herself from the table. By the time she entered the living room, her breathing was so hard and fast that she was becoming lightheaded. She shut herself in the downstairs toilet. She splashed water on her face and closed her eyes. "Mr. Plum," she whispered. And then it came to her. Everything. She reeled. She splashed more water on her face. She was sick in the lavatory. She cried tears of anguish, shock, pain, even sadness. She had not thought it possible. But she was wrong. "Mr. Plum," she said again. "The Cluedo game," she wailed. "You told me through the Cluedo game." She thought about the vanishing card. "Mr. Plum, with the rope, on the moor." Bronwyn re-entered the living room 3/4 of an hour later. A Scrabble game was in progress. "You coming to join us?" asked Nathan. "No, thanks." She looked at Seamus, who wasn't playing Scrabble either. Instead, he was reading a newspaper. "Dad, could we have a chat?" "Of course." "In private. I was going to go and feed the male pig, so perhaps we could talk there?" They went out the back door to the yard and went to the pig feed trough. Bronwyn filled a bucket and they headed round to the old cowshed where the pig was being housed. They turned on the lights as they entered and closed the door. "I'll take that," offered Seamus. "I'll take that," offered Seamus. Bronwyn handed him the bucket. She watched as he poured the mix into the feeder. "Dad," she began, "why did you hire Siobhan?" He turned. "To look after you lot, of course." He frowned. "Why do you think I hired her?" Bronwyn shrugged. Maybe for her body?" Seamus lowered the bucket. "I beg your pardon?" "She was very pretty, wasn't she, Dad?" "More so than Mum." "What the hell are you talking about?" Bronwyn sighed. "I'm talking about sex, Dad. You were having sex with Siobhan, weren't you? That's why you really hired her, isn't it? Because she was beautiful, and young and impressionable, perfect for the job, in fact." Seamus hadn't moved. He just stared at his daughter. "You started wooing her, didn't you? Slowly, obviously, because you had to be careful. Did you buy her little gifts?" Seamus said nothing. "The location of the room, that was important, wasn't it? If you wanted to go to her at night, you couldn't risk us hearing you. So A, you had to make sure her room was far enough away from any of us, and B, you had to make sure that it was easily accessible." Seamus began to chuckle now. He laid down the bucket. "That's what I love about old houses. There's always a secret passage. It was actually my father who first showed me the tower stairs." He smiled. "So you put her in that room, knowing that you could get to her without waking your children?" "Yes." "How long was it before you started having sex?" "About a year. I wanted her to settle in first, you see." He folded his arms and leaned casually against the pen wall. "When I first saw Siobhan, I knew I wanted her. She had the body of a goddess. To be fair, so did your mother for a time, but she let herself go a bit. Siobhan was fresh. Her skin had a lovely complexion. I loved her hair, her eyes. He paused as he visualized her. You know, there's only two things a woman is good for: housework and sex. He looked at Bronwyn. Sorry, but it's a fact. Oh, that's all right. Please, feel free to share that, he continued. I remember the first time I went up that tower. My heart was pounding. I couldn't believe I was actually going to be able to take my hand on those breasts. God, she was beautiful. You use condoms, of course, asked Bronwyn. Seamus remained silent. When did you get tired of using them? Again, he said nothing. I believe it's not the same feeling. Unprotected sex is much better. You were desperate. And then she told you she was barren. Seamus laughed. I couldn't believe it. It was such good news. We went at it hammer and tongs after that. It was great. Every Tuesday and Friday. Sometimes more. It depended on how I felt. And what about how she felt? Well, it didn't matter what she felt. That was one thing about Siobhan. She wasn't entirely stupid. She understood the rules pretty quickly. If she didn't want sex, she was punished. I was her master. And how did you punish her, Dad? Usually just a slap sorted her out. That's what I meant. Siobhan understood the rules. If I wanted to shag her, she had no say in the matter. So you raped her? No. She enjoyed it, Bron. Trust me, she did. No, I think she just persuaded herself that she enjoyed it. Why would she do that? Why? Because she loved us. She didn't want to be parted from us. So she put up with you, forcing yourself on her whenever you felt like it. And the only way she could do that was persuade herself that it was all somehow romantic. A young nanny with an employer who secretly made love to her. What an adventure it was. I don't like your tone, said Seamus. Bronwyn raised her eyebrows. Tough shit, Dad. Seamus scowled at her. As her employer, you had a responsibility for her well-being. Fucking her isn't doing that, is it? It's taking advantage. And you knew it perfectly well. Of course I knew it. She stared at him. You don't get it, do you, Bron? It's Bronwyn, she yelled. Oh, whatever. I don't like women, Bronwyn. I never have, not even my mother. I have my father to thank for that. Ah, a good role model, was he? An excellent role model. He kept the old ways alive through me. She shook her head. Anyway, where was I? Yes, contraception, or lack thereof. It was wonderful, until it all went wrong. Yes, said Seamus slowly, until it all went wrong. Doctors make mistakes too, said Bronwyn. Seamus's face became bitter. The stupid girl. If she'd just done as she was told. Yes, that's right. You like telling people what to do, don't you? But what you didn't know about Siobhan was that she wanted something far more than sex. Something you couldn't give her. Or so she thought. Seamus looked away. She wanted her own children, not someone else's. But when she found out she was pregnant, she was upset. Upset because she knew she would have to leave us. She couldn't very well go on living here whilst pregnant with your baby. Of course, she would have to tell you. It was only fair. She knew you would be angry, but she would have fled if she had known what you would really do. All she had to do was go to a private clinic. I would have paid for it. But she said no. You don't like it when people say no. And do you know why she refused? Because by the time it came to telling you, she knew beyond any doubt that that's what she wanted. It was the greatest chance of escape. Escape from the virtual bondage she had gone through for the past 4 years. She was determined enough. Seamus looked at the pig. So now I'm going to go ask you the question I've been asking for years. What happened that day? It was a while before Seamus answered. You were at school. Siobhan came back with the car. She said she needed to talk to me. I was busy, so I said I would talk to her later. But she said he couldn't wait. You're right, I was furious when she told me. And scared. If she had that baby, I would be found out. I told her immediately that what I wanted her to do. She flatly refused, said it wasn't an option. I told her to say nothing just now and we'd speak on it later. I had to make her change her mind. At 3:30, we took a walk on the moor. I needed somewhere we couldn't be disturbed. I was prepared to use a degree of force to get my point across, but this time she didn't react very well to a simple slap. She stormed off, screaming obscenities at me. I knew it wasn't going to work then. I also knew that all I had to do was go up behind her. Stop. I don't want to hear that. There were tears on her face now. She brushed them away. Seamus continued. Luckily it was cold, so I was wearing gloves. I laid her on the ground. She was so beautiful. She just looked like she was sleeping. Bronwyn almost choked on her tears. It was only then that I realised I loved her. Funny how things happen, isn't it? I knew how much I would miss her, so I took her jewels to have something to remember her by. Bronwyn closed her eyes. "You bastard," she said. And that was my downfall. I wanted to keep them somewhere close at hand, you see. So I took up a floorboard in our bedroom and hid them under there. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I would secretly take them out and look at them. How did Kieran find them? By accident. He showed up at the house that day. Your mother was away on a church outing for a couple of days. The house was empty. I had decided to remove the jewels early. I laid them out on the bed. I got off on it, pretending she was there, naked, aroused. That was the thing about Siobhan. Even during sex she kept her jewellery on. It made her look even sexier. Kieran had brought us a television he didn't want. I think he thought it would be a surprise for us to find it all set up in our room. I was on the moor when he arrived and let himself in. By the time I got back to the house at 6, I found his car and his note on the kitchen table. He wanted to meet me at the Giant's pub as soon as I got back. He said there were things to discuss. I went upstairs and found the television dumped on the floor, so I knew he had seen the jewellery. I didn't meet him as he wanted. I held off for a few hours, thinking things over. I sat out around 10ish. I didn't take the car. Too noticeable. I was going to wait for him at the bridge. It turned out I didn't have to wait long. He confronted me with his accusations. Of course, he knew Siobhan's jewellery as well as I did. I knew he'd be drunk. I knew he had a problem. But he was drunker than I expected. Like Siobhan, he just needed to have his back to me for a moment. All it took was one hard shove. He barely even made a noise as he went over. In water that cold, those currents, no light, and drunk, I knew he wouldn't make it. I also knew it would be put down as an accident. "How could you do that to him? Your own son?" Seamus shrugged. I had no choice, did I? I walked on the moor for an hour after that, trying to compose myself. Oh, well, I trust the fresh air worked wonders for your dad. And what about Mum? What happened with her? She found the jewels too. Very unfortunate that was. You see, she'd been shopping and, against my wishes, had bought a pair of high heels for a lunch she was going to be attending. Again, I was working at the time. She decided to try them on. The floorboards in our room could have done with replacing years ago. One of her heels went straight through a plank. The same plank I'd taken up 20 years earlier. It made a big enough hole that you could see a little bundle of cloth in the space between. Of course, she had to have a look, didn't she? Then what happened? She pretended she didn't know what they were, but she still asked me all the same. I said I'd never seen them before in my life. I could see in her eyes she didn't believe me. So I poisoned her with her own sleeping tablets. Your mother suffered from insomnia in her latter years. Good thing she slept well when Siobhan was around. Oh, come off it. You think she wouldn't know? You clearly never touched her. Anyway, I knew it had to look like another accident, especially as Nathan was arriving shortly. As luck would have it, she once took an overdose of her sleeping tablets, and the doctor had warned her about doing that. He had told her she needed to be extremely careful because it could easily be fatal. Your mother was very predictable. She liked routines. Before bed every night she would have a bunch of grapes, a glass of milk and a chocolate orange fondant. Sometimes she'd have two, depending on how she felt. She would then take her sleeping tablets and read for half an hour. When she was at her lunch, I took the orange fondants and a slim kitchen knife. I ground down 8 sleeping tablets in a mortar and carefully sliced off the top of 2 chocolates, scooping out the interiors and mixing the fondant with the ground tablets. I then split up the mixture, replaced it in the sweets and sealed them back up, melting them with a lighter. There were 5 fondants left. I ate 3 of them, thinking that I would tell her a friend from Colston had come round and I had offered the chocolates to them. Even if she ate just one, I knew it would be enough, along with the tablet she took, to potentially kill her. As it turned out, I was right. When she arrived back, I told her I was going to a conference on conservation work in Colston. Nathan would be arriving at 7. There was no conference, of course. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't on the scene. A nice touch. Lovely. She kept her gaze with him for a moment. It was also a nice touch to lay her out in her coffin, so all the villagers could goggle at her. Seamus sighed, but not through regret. So, now you know. Bronwyn narrowed her eyes. Yes, now I know. I know you killed our nanny. I know you killed my brother and my mother. And I know that I hate you more than anyone alive. So what are you going to do now? Asked Seamus. In fact, don't answer that. I'll tell you what you're going to do. He stepped towards her. You're going to stay here with me. He ran his fingers slowly across her cheek. You are beautiful, Bronwyn. No doubt you had a wonderful life ahead of you. He sighed again. But I can't let you leave this barn. Bronwyn's chest began to heave. What are you saying? You didn't think I was going to give you that information for free, did you? He tut-tutted. Everything comes at a price, especially a confession like that. His hand slipped around her throat. He caressed it with his thumb. You're going to kill your only daughter as well? What's one less pathetic bitch in the world? You hate life anyway, Bron. I'll be doing you a favour. Oh, what are you going to do? Bronwyn's voice trembled. Pigs can be very dangerous animals. They can be unpredictable. I happen to know that this pig has a bit of a temper. If you climbed into his pen for whatever reason, he knocks you over. You fall. Hit your head. He shrugged. Do you see what I'm getting at? His hand suddenly tightened in his grip on her throat. Behind her head was a rack of tools. He forced her backwards and grabbed a wooden mallet. You're going to beat my head in with that? No. I was thinking about stroking you with it. I don't think you have the balls, Seamus. Oh, you'd be surprised what balls I have, young lady. Siobhan discovered that in more ways than one. He chuckled at his own sick joke, and tightened his grip on the mallet. Sweet dreams, baby girl. There's just one thing you haven't counted on with me, Dad. What's that? Did you think I'd be stupid enough to come out here on my own? Well, guess what? I'm not as stupid as you think. Isn't that right, Detective? Detective Mayer stood up from where he'd concealed himself in one of the old cow pens. He turned off the recording device in his hand and waved it at Seamus. High-definition dictaphone. Very useful for secretly recording confessions. Seamus made a bolt for the door. Mayer let him go. He yanked it open and ran headlong into 2 officers. They pushed him back inside and flattened him against the wall, cuffing his wrists behind his back. Seamus Doyle, I'm arresting you for the murders of Siobhan Bailey, Kieran Doyle and Margaret Doyle. He then proceeded to read him his rights. Get him out of here. The officers escorted him away. Bronwyn flung her arms around Lucius. Thank you, she said. Thank you, replied Mayer, for being so brave. When you phoned, I was really worried, but it was the only way to do it. There's just one last thing we need to do. Recover her jewels. Mayer nodded. We'll get those boards up. They left the barn and began walking across the yard. The police car was parked at the far end. Mayer suddenly started running towards it. Bronwyn watched him in surprise, and then she saw what he had seen. The 2 officers slumped on the ground next to it. She ran after him. Both men were semi-conscious. Both of them had blood running down the sides of their faces. Mayer quickly checked them over, made a call on the radio for an ambulance, and stood up. The only place he could have gone is the moor. Let's go. It's pitch black. How are we going to find them? Mayer grabbed a flashlight from the back seat. "Very powerful," he said. "But which direction did we go?" Mayer paused to think. "Wait a minute," said Bronwyn. She dashed inside. 10 seconds later she came running back out, Wolfgang skipping along at her heels. "Where's Master? Find Master!" Wolfgang ran around a bit, his nose to the ground as usual. "Master! Where's Master?" His tail waved excitedly. Then suddenly he seemed to pick up a scent and instantly started to follow it. His tail went mad. He headed straight for the little gate which led out onto the moor. "Let's just hope he hasn't just picked up a rabbit." "Master," said Bronwyn again. Wolfgang whined impatiently as he waited for the gate to be opened. Once it did, he shot through it. Mayer turned on the flashlight. Seamus stumbled blindly through the darkness. He fell several times. It wasn't helped by the fact that his hands were cuffed behind him. His head throbbed from where he had headbutted the two officers. He didn't know if anybody was following. He just had to keep going. He had been running for 10 minutes when he suddenly ran straight into a ditch. He hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of himself. As he lay trying to get his breath back, he heard something. At first it was just a rustle of leaves, which he took no notice of. But then the rustling became more prominent, as if somebody was moving towards him. He lay still, listening. It was then that he heard the sobs, pitiful, anger-filled sobs. He was aware of a pale light begin to form behind him. With almost his last ounce of energy, he forced himself onto his back. Seamus would have had the energy to scream had it not been for the fact that his heart stopped before he had the chance to do so. Wolfgang discovered his master a quarter of an hour later, lying dead on his back in a wet ditch. Bronwyn watched as Mayer used a crowbar to lever up the planks. He managed to get up 6, with no bundle anywhere to be seen. He may have moved them to a more secure location. Unless we ransack the entire house, we may not find them. Bronwyn suddenly began to laugh. She shook her head slowly. "I should have got it. She told me. I should have got it." "Got what?" "If you wanted to hide something for good, somewhere where no one would find it, where would you hide it?" Mayer shrugged. "Where?" "Your dead wife's coffin, perhaps." It was a cold Monday morning in the churchyard. A small group of people were gathered around the freshly exhumed coffin of Margaret Doyle. As the lid came off, several of them stepped back, but the detective and Bronwyn leaned forward. Mayer put his hands into the folds of the woman's Sunday best and removed something from an inside pocket, a small bundle of cloth. He unwrapped it, revealing a pearl necklace and a ring with a red stone. "I'm taking them back to her parents," said Bronwyn to Nathan as they parted at the gate. Nathan nodded. "Listen, I owe an apology. I thought you... I know." She looked at him, frowning. "I know the way you think, Bron. I just want to know why you thought it was me. All that talk about girlfriends. I thought you thought I had slept with Siobhan when I was 15. Jesus, Bron, you know what that was all about? Her name was Claire Dunswick. I tried to kiss her at a party, and she never spoke to me again. Happy now?" Bronwyn giggled. "What?" "Nothing," she said, a huge smirk on her face. As she was walking away, Nathan said, "Oh, Bronwyn, cut down on the fags." Yeah, she replied. Ken was standing by the car, talking to Mark. "Give me a hug," she said. They embraced. "Now, when are you coming to see us?" "I don't know. I'll see if I can take some time off." She kissed him. "Don't leave it too long," she said. Ken's mobile suddenly rang. He pulled it out. "Anna?" asked Bronwyn. He nodded. "Good luck." "Hello, Anna." "Ken, listen to me. I'm sorry for... You don't need to apologize for anything. I would have hung up too, if you had spoken to me like that." She sighed. "Look, I'm coming back today. What if you take the boys to your mother's tonight?" There was a pause. Ken smiled. "I bet I know what you're doing now," he said.